Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the less-travelled corridors of history. I hope this finds you comfortable, perhaps nestled under blankets, the day's demands finally behind you, ready to let your mind wander through time while your body settles into rest. Before we begin, if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's darker corners, consider subscribing to Boring History. It helps more than you might imagine, and costs you nothing but a moment's click. But no pressure. You're here now, and that's what matters. Now then, where are you listening from tonight? A bedroom in Seattle? A flat in Manchester? Perhaps you're somewhere else entirely, somewhere the night comes earlier or later than it does for me. Wherever you are, I want you to close your eyes for a moment, or keep them softly focused on nothing in particular, and picture something with me. Picture a beach on the English coast, sometime around 865 CE. It's early morning, fog rolling in from the sea, the kind of damp grey dawn that makes everything feel muffled and uncertain. You're a young farmer from Northumbria, maybe checking fishing nets or gathering driftwood for the fire, and then you see them, shapes emerging from the fog. Boats, long, low boats with dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning mist, and you realise with the kind of cold dread that empties your stomach that your life is about to change forever, or more likely, to end. We've all heard the stories of Viking raiders. The imagery is burned into popular consciousness. Fierce warriors in horned helmets, seeking glory and adventure on distant shores. The sagas paint them as heroes, as legendary figures whose deeds echo through the centuries. Movies and television have given us dragon ships and shield walls and dramatic last stands. Even the word Viking conjures romance, the romance of the sea, of exploration, of living free and wild. Tonight, we're going to strip all that romance away. We're going to examine what it actually meant to be on a Viking raid in England. Not from the comfortable distance of saga or screenplay, but from the cold, wet, terrified perspective of someone actually living it. We're going to explore why you, specifically you, wouldn't have lasted a day. Not because you're weak or cowardly, neither of those things matter when the mathematics of survival are this brutal, but because Viking raiding was less glorious adventure and a more calculated horror show, a meat grinder that consumed desperate young men and occasionally spat out traumatised survivors who counted themselves lucky. Over the next few hours, and yes, we'll be here a while, so settle in, we're going to walk through every stage of a raid. The recruitment, where desperate farmers were sold dreams of silver. The crossing, where the North Sea killed you before England could. The landing, the march, the starvation, the combat, the disease, the retreat. We'll examine the internal violence within raiding, parties, the English resistance that proved far more organised than myths suggest, the disabled veterans and wasted silver and families destroyed. We'll look at the fatal mathematics that meant most raiders died young, poor and far from home. This is boring history after all, not the exciting version you see in media, but the mundane horror of economic desperation driving young men into suicidal gambles they couldn't win. So let's begin at the beginning, with how these raiders were assembled in the first place. Let us turn our attention to the spring thaw in Scandinavia, when the ice melted and the recruitment calls went out. To understand why Viking raiding happened when and where it did, we need to establish the geographic and temporal landscape. We're primarily discussing the period from roughly 789 CE, the first recorded raid on English shores, through the early 900s, when the nature of Viking activity in England shifted from raiding to settlement and conquest. This century plus represents the classic Viking raid period that dominates popular imagination, though Viking activity continued in various forms for another 2 centuries. The geography shaped everything. Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden offered challenging agricultural conditions. Short growing seasons, poor soil in many regions, mountainous terrain limiting arable land. Population growth in the 700s created pressure on limited resources. Primogeniture inheritance customs meant younger sons inherited nothing, creating a surplus of landless young men with warrior training but no economic prospects. Meanwhile, across the North Sea lay England, wealthy, relatively disorganised politically, filled with churches and monasteries that advertised their riches through elaborate buildings. The proximity made raiding practical. 2 to 5 days sailing versus weeks or months to other targets. England itself in the late 700s was fragmented into multiple kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Kent, and smaller territories. These kingdoms were frequently at war with each other, meaning military resources were divided and coastal defences were minimal. The focus was on internal conflicts, not external threats from the sea. This political fragmentation created opportunities for raiders. Attack one kingdom, and the others wouldn't necessarily respond. No unified English defence existed until Alfred the Great's reforms in the late 800s. By then, raiding had been occurring for nearly a century. The North Sea itself deserves consideration as a geographic feature. It's a body of water approximately 400 miles across at the narrowest point between Norway and England, wider in other directions. The sea conditions are notoriously dangerous. Strong currents, sudden storms, cold temperatures even in summer. The Vikings didn't have maritime superiority because of technological advantages. Their ships were excellent, but not miraculous. They had superiority because they were willing to accept casualty rates during crossings that other cultures found unacceptable. When 10% of your fleet might not make the crossing, but the potential rewards justify the risk, you keep sailing. Other cultures looked at those odds and stayed home. The temporal context matters because raiding evolved over the period. Early raids, the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE is the most famous, were small-scale, opportunistic hit-and-run affairs. A few ships, a quick strike on an undefended target, immediate retreat. By the 850s, raids had scaled up dramatically. Fleets of dozens or hundreds of ships, organised campaigns lasting months, coordinated attacks on multiple targets. The Great Heathen Army that arrived in 865 CE represented a shift from raiding to invasion. Thousands of warriors seeking not quick plunder but permanent settlement. Our focus tonight is primarily on the earlier period, roughly 789 to 870 CE, when raiding was still the dominant pattern and when individual young men might join a raiding expedition hoping to return home wealthy. The seasonal rhythm structured everything. Raiding happened in the sailing season, late April through early September. Winter sailing was suicidal, autumn was dangerously risky, and early spring was problematic due to storms. This meant raids clustered in a narrow window, where North Sea conditions were merely dangerous rather than certainly fatal. It also meant that raiding competed directly with agricultural work. The months you'd spend raiding were the same months your farm needed intensive labour. Families made brutal choices. Keep men home and ensure the harvest but remain poor, or send men raiding and gamble both on their survival and on women and children successfully bringing in crops without male labour. Both options were bad. One simply offered the possibility of dramatic improvement alongside the risk of catastrophe. The cultural context of Viking raiding requires understanding both Scandinavian society and English society in this period, because the collision between them defined the raiding experience. Scandinavian culture in the late 700s and 800s was stratified, but relatively fluid compared to more rigid feudal systems developing elsewhere in Europe. At the top were jarls, powerful landholders with military followings. Below them were carls, free farmers who owned land and had legal rights. At the bottom were thralls, slaves who owned nothing and had no legal personhood. Mobility between these classes was possible, particularly through military success or economic accumulation. This created incentive structures. A carl's younger son, facing inheritance of nothing, might raid successfully, accumulate wealth, buy land and establish his own household, or he might die trying. The system encouraged risk-taking. Norse religion played a complex role. The worship of gods like Odin, Thor and Freya emphasised martial valour, but it didn't romanticise death the way later interpretations suggest. Vikings weren't seeking death in battle to reach Valhalla. They were seeking victory and wealth. Death was acknowledged as likely, and the mythology provided frameworks for understanding it, but the goal was always survival and success. The fatalism we associate with Vikings, when your day comes, it comes, was more about accepting risk than seeking death. It was a psychological adaptation to living in a society where violence was common and death could arrive suddenly. Better to accept that reality than be paralysed by fear of it. English society in this period was Christian, but recently and incompletely. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had occurred over the previous 2 centuries, and pockets of paganism remained. The church was enormously wealthy. Centuries of donations from nobles seeking salvation had accumulated in monasteries and churches. These institutions were also centres of learning, literacy and art. The illuminated manuscripts, gold chalices, jewelled crosses and silk vestments represented not just material wealth, but cultural treasures. When Vikings raided monasteries, they were destroying irreplaceable cultural artefacts while enriching themselves. The monks who created these works often died defending them, and the works themselves were melted down or sold to buyers who valued gold weight over artistic merit. The political relationship between Scandinavia and England had been minimal before raiding began. There was some trade, English wool and metal goods for Scandinavian furs and amber, but contact was limited. The first raids came as complete surprises. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's famous entry about Lindisfarne in 793 CE conveys the shock. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The English simply hadn't conceived of seaborne raids as a threat. Their military infrastructure was designed for land-based conflicts with other English kingdoms, or with the Welsh or Scots. Coastal defences were non-existent because no one had attacked from the sea in living memory. This lack of preparation is crucial to understanding why early raids succeeded so dramatically. It wasn't that Vikings were militarily superior. English forces, when mustered and properly led, proved capable of defeating Viking raiders repeatedly. It was that the English weren't prepared for the specific threat pattern. Fast-moving seaborne forces striking undefended coastal or river-accessible targets, and retreating before significant resistance could be organised. By the time alarm was raised, raiders were gone. This advantage lasted roughly 60 years before English defensive adaptations, particularly Alfred's burh system and standing military forces, changed the calculation. The cultural clash was also religious. To the English, these were pagan attacks on Christian civilization, proof of God's displeasure or a test of faith. To the Vikings, these were simply targets of opportunity. The religious significance of churches and monasteries was irrelevant except insofar as it meant concentrated wealth and minimal military defence. This religious framing intensified the brutality on both sides. English forces felt justified in showing no mercy to heathen raiders. Vikings felt no moral constraints about killing monks or destroying churches. The result was escalating violence that horrified chroniclers on both sides. Understanding this cultural and historical background helps contextualise the individual experiences we're about to explore in detail. Young Norse men weren't raiding because of inherent savagery, or because their culture uniquely valued violence. They raided because their economic and social systems incentivised it, because the opportunities existed, and because the potential rewards outweighed the risks for those desperate enough to try. And English victims weren't dying because of weakness or divine punishment. They were dying because they lived in wealthy, poorly defended locations that made rational targets for profit-motivated violence. Both sides were operating within logical frameworks that happened to generate centuries of brutality. Now, before we dive into the 25 chapters ahead, Let me be clear about what we're arguing tonight. The thesis of this extended examination is straightforward. You, as an individual human being transported to the Viking Age and placed on a raiding expedition to England, would almost certainly not survive the experience. Not because you lack courage, or intelligence, or physical capability, but because the survival requirements were so extreme, and the margin for error so small, that even experienced raiders had survival rates that make modern military combat look safe by comparison. But more than that, even if you somehow survived, and let's be generous and assume you're in the lucky minority, you still wouldn't last in the sense of thriving or benefiting. The physical survival is only part of the equation. There's psychological survival, the trauma that would permanently alter who you are. There's social survival, reintegrating into peaceful society after participation in atrocities. There's economic survival, actually converting plunder into lasting security rather than watching it evaporate through social pressures and poor decisions. And there's moral survival, living with what you did, who you killed, what you witnessed and participated in. The popular image of Viking raiders emphasizes their success. The wealthy returns, the glory, the adventure. This is survivorship bias on a massive scale. We remember and celebrate the survivors, particularly the successful survivors. The sagas were written about the exceptional individuals who not only survived but thrived. They don't memorialise the hundreds or thousands of young men who died on their first raid, or who returned disabled and impoverished, or who survived physically but were destroyed psychologically. History written by survivors always emphasises survival. It can't include the perspectives of those who died, who constitute the majority. What we're going to do over the next 25 chapters is walk through every stage and aspect of Viking raiding with brutal honesty about the odds, the conditions, the violence and the outcomes. We'll see how recruitment exploited the desperate, how the North Sea crossing killed before combat began, how landing zones were kill zones if the English were prepared, how forced marches through hostile territory thinned raiding parties through attrition, how starvation and disease killed more reliably than swords, how the combat itself was mutual slaughter, not glorious duelling, how internal violence within raiding parties meant you were at risk from your own companions, how English resistance evolved to make raiding increasingly suicidal, how successful raids ended in drowning on overloaded return voyages, how survivors came home traumatised, often disabled, and watched their silver evaporate through social pressures. Each chapter will examine one specific aspect that would likely kill you, disable you, or destroy you psychologically. By the end, the cumulative effect should be clear. This wasn't an adventure or a path to glory. It was a brutal economic system that ground up desperate young men, distributed most of the gains to those who organised raids rather than those who executed them, and left trails of trauma, death, and broken families across Scandinavia and England alike. This isn't to romanticise English victims or condemn Vikings as uniquely evil. The English engaged in their own brutalities. The treatment of captured raiders was savage, the response to Viking settlement sometimes genocidal. This is simply to remove the gloss of adventure and glory and see raiding for what it actually was. Economically motivated violence executed under conditions almost designed to maximise human suffering. The kind of boring, brutal history that doesn't make for good entertainment but reveals far more about how human societies actually function. So with that context established, the geography that made raiding possible, the cultures that shaped both raiders and victims, and the thesis that you wouldn't survive this experience, let's begin our detailed journey through what a Viking raid actually entailed. We've already set the stage. Now let's walk through it, step by horrifying step. Chapter 1. The Recruitment. The spring thaw brought more than melting ice to Norse villages. It brought the recruitment calls. As winters released their grip on Scandinavia, jarls and ship captains moved through settlements, eyes scanning for able bodies to fill their raiding crews. These weren't grand military levies with fanfare and ceremony. They were calculated business propositions delivered in mead halls and at market squares, promises of silver and glory whispered to men who just survived another brutal winter with empty storage pits and mounting debts. The pitch was always the same: join the summer raids on England, return with enough wealth to secure your family's future, earn a reputation that would echo through the generations. For young men especially, the call was intoxicating. A chance to escape the grinding poverty of subsistence farming. Picture, if you will, a typical recruitment scene in a Norwegian coastal village around 865 CE. The ship captain stands before a fire, his arm rings gleaming in the flicklight, leather pouch heavy with last season's silver jingling as he moves. He speaks of undefended monasteries overflowing with gold chalices and jewelled crosses, of English villages so wealthy their peasants wear silver brooches, of land so rich you can practically smell the coin from offshore. The younger men lean forward, eyes bright with imagination. The older men exchange knowing glances but say nothing. They've heard these pictures before, watched ships leave full and return half empty. The captain doesn't mention the North Sea storms, the English swords, the diseased water, the very real possibility of never seeing home again. He offers the dream, not the nightmare. What made this recruitment truly brutal was how it targeted the desperate. Most men who signed onto raiding crews weren't adventure seekers or glory-hungry warriors from the sagas. They were farmers drowning in debt to local chieftains, younger sons with no inheritance prospects, men whose families would starve without an infusion of wealth. Refusal wasn't always an option. Some jarls demanded contributions of men from the territories they controlled, a feudal obligation enforced with violence. Those who tried to resist found their farms burned, or their families harassed until compliance came. The volunteers often volunteered at sword point. Even those who genuinely chose to go did so from a menu of terrible options: risk death abroad, or watch your children starve at home. The silver promises were bait for human traps. Consider young Eric, a composite of countless real recruits documented in fragmented sagas and archaeological evidence. 22 years old, new father, inheritor of his deceased father's debts to the local jarl, debts that could be erased by one successful raid season. His wife is 3 months pregnant with their first child. He knows nothing of sailing, less of combat, but the alternative is losing his small plot of land and becoming a landless thrall himself. He joins the crew of a Nar heading to England, promised an equal share of whatever plunder they take. He believes the promises because he has to. The night before departure, he holds his wife and tries not to think about the fact that many ships never return. He leaves at dawn, looking back at smoke rising from his hearth, wondering if he'll ever see it again. So the next time you scroll through job listings with manageable risk and legal protections, remember Eric and his generation. They answered recruitment calls not to opportunities, but to gambles with their lives as the wager. Modern multi-level marketing schemes and predatory recruitment at least don't involve North Sea crossings and English swords. The desperation that drives people into terrible decisions hasn't changed in 12 centuries. Just the specific nightmares on offer. Chapter 2. The Nar Journey. The romanticism of Viking voyages dies about 6 hours into an actual North Sea crossing. These weren't sleek dragon ships from tapestries. Most raids used Nars, cargo vessels built for capacity over comfort, modified to cram 50 to 70 men into a space designed for 20 sailors and their trade goods. Imagine a vessel 50 feet long and 15 feet wide, open to the elements, with men packed shoulder to shoulder on rowing benches and in the bilge. No cabins, no shelter, no protection from spray or rain, or the relentless wind. The crossing from Norway to England typically took 2 to 5 days depending on weather and currents, though storms could extend it to a week. Every minute of those days was endured, not travelled. The crossing began with rowing out of the fjord. men's backs straining against oars, finding rhythm, muscles remembering. Once in open water, the single square sail was raised if winds favoured, and the true misery commenced. The North Sea in spring is cold, desperately, bone-achingly cold. Air temperature hovers around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, water temperature 10 degrees colder. Within an hour, everyone is soaked from spray. Wool clothing, supposedly water-resistant, becomes heavy and clammy against skin. There's no way to get dry, no way to warm up. Men huddle together for body heat, but with 70 bodies packed together, there's barely room to shift position. Sleep comes in fragments, heads nodding against neighbours' shoulders, jolting awake when waves hit differently. Constant motion triggers seasickness in even experienced sailors. The smell becomes indescribable. Vomit, unwashed bodies, the bilge water sloshing beneath the floorboards, carrying all manner of filth. What made this journey truly nightmarish was the mortality rate before reaching England. Hypothermia killed men in their sleep when temperatures dropped at night. They simply didn't wake up, found cold and stiff come morning. The spray-soaked clothing that couldn't be changed became a death sentence for the weak or sick. There were no toilets, no privacy. Men relieved themselves over the side if seas were calm, or where they sat if seas were not. Dysentery spread quickly in these conditions. The stench of human waste mixed with vomit and bilge water created a miasma that clung to everything. And this was the journey before the raid even began. Anglo-Saxon chronicles occasionally describe bodies washing ashore from Viking vessels, ships that capsized in storms, or simply foundered from overloading, men drowning while trapped in the crowded hull. The fragmentary accounts from the period give glimpses of these tragedies. In one instance recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, English coastal villagers found a Nar run aground, with its entire crew dead from exposure. The vessel hadn't capsized, hadn't been attacked. The men had simply succumbed to cold and exhaustion during a particularly brutal crossing. Their bodies were still in rowing positions, frozen in place, fingers locked around oar handles. Whatever silver or equipment they carried was claimed by the English as divine providence. Those men died before striking a single blow, before seeing a single monastery, before earning a single coin. Their families back home would wait years before accepting they were never coming back. We complain about economy-class airline seats and 6-hour flights with functioning bathrooms and climate control. We get irritated about delays and lost luggage. Try to imagine 5 days on an open boat in near-freezing temperatures, soaked through, unable to stand or lie down properly, surrounded by sick and dying men, knowing you're sailing toward a hostile land where people will try to kill you. That was the price of admission for raiding. The journey that broke men before battle ever could. And this was just the beginning. Chapter 3. The Landing Zones. Choosing where to land in England was the first life or death decision of any raid. Viking navigators looked for specific features: beaches with gradual slopes for easy boat landing, proximity to rivers for inland access, isolated locations away from major settlements, clear sight lines to spot English patrols. River mouths were ideal: the Thames, the Humber, the Severn, allowing raiders to sail inland and strike targets miles from the coast. But beaches had advantages too: faster landing, quicker escape, less risk of being trapped upstream. Every landing zone was a calculation balancing opportunity against vulnerability. Get it wrong, and the raid ended before it began. The moment of landing was chaos and desperation. The Nar would be run aground as close to shore as possible, but in most cases that still meant men jumping into waist-deep or shoulder-deep water. Imagine it. You've just endured days of brutal sea crossing. You're exhausted and cold and sick, and now you're climbing over the side of a rocking boat in full gear. You hit the water, shockingly cold, and wade towards shore. Your wool clothing soaks up water like a sponge, becoming incredibly heavy. The weapons and equipment you're carrying, shield, axe or spear, Maybe a sword, food sack, rope suddenly weigh twice as much. Your feet sink into mud or slip on rocks. Waves push you off balance. You can't run, can barely walk, and you're completely vulnerable. If the English are waiting, you're a slow-moving target struggling through surf. What made landing truly terrifying was that English coastal communities had learned quickly. After the first surprise raids of the late 700s, villages and monasteries near the coast established watch systems. Beacons, riders, warning networks, systems specifically designed to spot dragon ships on the horizon and raise alarm. By the mid-800s, landing a Viking raiding party without being observed was increasingly difficult. And the English had learned something crucial. Vikings were most vulnerable in the surf. Strike them while they're disembarking. When half are still on the boat, half are in the water, everyone is disorganised and weighed down, and you can massacre an entire raiding party before they even form ranks. Archaeological evidence suggests this happened more often than sagas admit. The very first recorded Viking attack on England demonstrates this vulnerability. In 789 CE, 3 ships landed at Portland. The local reeve, Beduherd, rowed out with a few men, believing them to be traders. The ship's crews killed him and his companions immediately. But imagine if Beduherd had brought 100 armed men instead of a welcoming committee. Those Vikings, caught between ships and shore, would have been slaughtered. By 850 CE, English forces had learned this lesson. Raiding parties increasingly found armed resistance waiting at landing zones, turning the beaches red before raiders could organise. We think of Vikings as fearsome invaders catching helpless victims by surprise, but the reality had layers of counter-strategy. Every landing was a gamble. Bet right on an undefended beach, you had hours to raid before reinforcements arrived. Bet wrong, and you died in the surf, weighed down by your own equipment, drowning or speared before reaching dry land. The nightmare of being attacked while most vulnerable, stepping off a bus into an ambush, emerging from a subway into a riot, gives a taste of what landing in hostile territory felt like. Except you can't call for backup, can't retreat to safety, can't even run at full speed because you're soaking wet and carrying 40 pounds of gear. Some raids ended in the first 10 minutes, red foam mixing with waves. Chapter 4. The March Inland. Once ashore, the raid truly began. Forced marches through unfamiliar territory, laden with equipment, racing against time and English response. A Viking raider's kit weighed 30 to 50 pounds, shield, weapons, rope, food sack, water skin, maybe chainmail if you were wealthy or lucky enough to loot it. Now add the exhaustion from days of sea crossing, the fact that you're still wet and cold from landing, that you've barely eaten in days, and that you're walking through English countryside with exactly zero knowledge of where you're going. Most raiders had never been to England before. They had no maps, no GPS, no reliable intelligence beyond monastery roughly that direction. They relied on forced guides, captured locals made to lead them, knowing they'd be killed when no longer useful. Picture a raiding band of 40 men moving through East Anglia at night. It's late spring, 867 CE, a few hours after landing. They've been walking for 5 hours already through forest and marsh. The man beside you keeps coughing, that wet, rattling cough that means his lungs are full of fluid from the sea crossing. Every step sucks at your shoes in the mud. Your shoulders ache from the shield's weight. You haven't eaten since yesterday. Somewhere in the darkness an owl calls and everyone freezes. Is it an owl or an English signal? The captured peasant leading the group gestures vaguely ahead. Is he telling the truth about the monastery's location, or leading you into an ambush? There's no way to know. You keep walking because stopping means the men behind you trip, because the English might be tracking you, because dawn is coming and you need darkness for the attack. What made these marches brutal was the attrition. Men with twisted ankles couldn't keep the pace. They'd fall behind and the group wouldn't wait. English militia fighters hunted stragglers like wolves culling injured deer. You'd hear a scream behind you in the darkness, then nothing. One fewer to split the silver with, the veterans would say. Those who fell ill from the journey who couldn't maintain the pace simply disappeared. The group couldn't slow down. English warning systems meant that within hours of landing, every Thegn and Ealdorman within 20 miles knew Vikings were ashore. Beacon fires would be lit. Third militias would be mustering. The window for striking and retreating was narrow, maybe 6 to 12 hours before organised resistance formed. Every minute spent marching was a minute closer to being cut off from your ships. Archaeological evidence tells these lost stories. Researchers have found remains of single males in marshes and forests, often with Viking-era weapons or equipment, miles from any known battlefield. These were likely stragglers or lost raiders who never made it back to their boats. One particularly haunting find: a skeleton still clutching a Norse-style sword, found in a bog in eastern England. Forensic analysis suggesting he died from exhaustion and exposure rather than violence. He simply gave out during the march, collapsed in the marsh, and died alone while his companions continued on. No saga remembers his name. The modern military, with all their conditioning, GPS, supply lines and medical evacuation, still sees soldiers break down on forced marches. Now imagine Viking raiders, farmers pressed into service, already weakened from brutal sea crossings, navigating hostile territory in darkness. Many raids ended not in glorious battle, but in exhausted men lost in foreign forests, dying quietly in the mud. Chapter 5. The Hunger Reality. Food on a Viking raid was a constant gnawing problem that shaped every decision. The salted fish and hard bread loaded onto ships in Scandinavia ran out quickly. After the 5-day crossing, you might have 2 days' rations left, maybe 3 if carefully managed. From that point forward, raiders ate what they could steal, scavenge, or forcibly take. This wasn't adventure dining, this was survival nutrition, and it killed nearly as many men as English swords. The fantasy of feasting warriors gorging on meat and mead had no place in raiding reality. Most of the time, you were hungry. Sometimes you were starving, and frequently what food you found would kill you. Logistics were brutal and simple. A raiding party of 50 men needed enormous amounts of food daily, but carrying food meant less room for plunder, so raiders travelled light, planning to live off the land, a euphemism for theft and slaughter. They'd hit a village or farm, slaughter livestock on the spot, eat what they could immediately, carry whatever didn't spoil, raw grain from storage buildings, consumed uncooked, because lighting fires revealed your position. Vegetables pulled from gardens and eaten unwashed. Milk from farms, often already soured. Meat that hadn't been properly preserved, already turning in the spring warmth. Water sources were questionable at best. Rivers and streams contaminated by upstream villages. Stagnant pools breeding disease. The desperate thirst after marching would drive men to drink anything, regardless of smell or taste. What made this truly deadly was the epidemic dysentery that ravaged raiding parties. Contaminated food and water caused severe gastrointestinal illness that spread through crews with terrifying speed. Once dysentery hit a raiding band, it became catastrophic. Men would develop bloody diarrhea, severe cramping, fever. Dehydration came fast, and finding clean water to replace fluids was nearly impossible. The disease spread person to person through the cramped conditions on ships and in temporary camps. Within days, half the raiding party might be incapacitated, shitting blood, too weak to walk, let alone fight. More raiders died from food poisoning and waterborne disease than from combat wounds in many documented campaigns. The Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, encountering Rus Vikings on the Volga in the early 900s, documented their eating habits with horrified fascination. He described watching them consume meat that was clearly spoiled, seeing them vomit from the rotten food, then continue eating it anyway because there was nothing else. They'd eat, vomit, eat again, a a cycle of desperate caloric intake that seems insane until you understand the alternative was starvation. English raids operated under similar desperation. The silver you were risking your life for couldn't be eaten. The monastery treasures were useless if you starved before reaching them. Men made impossible calculations, eat the questionable meat and risk death from poison, or don't eat and guarantee death from hunger. We throw away food that's a day past the expiration date, agonise over restaurant choices, stock refrigerators with abundant variety. The absolute baseline of food security we take for granted, knowing you'll eat today, that the food won't kill you, that clean water exists, was absent from Viking raiding life. They waged warfare while starving, fought battles while sick from contaminated food, endured forced marches while their guts twisted from dysentery. The mundane act of eating became another way to die, just slower than swords. Every meal was a gamble, nutrition or poison, survival or sickness, and there was no good choice, only less terrible ones. That's boring history for you. The inglorious reality that glory-hungry warriors spent as much time shitting in bushes as swinging axes, and that more of them died from bad food than bad luck. Chapter 6. The Target Selection. Choosing which settlement to attack wasn't random pillaging. It was calculated risk assessment that required intelligence gathering, often through horrific means. Raiders needed to know: what wealth does the target hold? How many defenders? Stone walls or wooden palisades? Escape routes if things go wrong? This information came from scouts, from captured locals, from traders who'd visited the area, from previous raiders' reports. The most valuable intelligence came from torture. Captured peasants or travelling merchants would be interrogated violently about nearby monasteries, manor houses, villages with silver. The screaming served dual purposes: extract information and terrorise other captives into cooperation. This wasn't honourable reconnaissance, it was terrorism as tactical doctrine. Monasteries were preferred targets for obvious reasons: concentrated wealth in the form of gold chalices, jewelled crosses, illuminated manuscripts with silver fittings, silk vestments. More importantly, they were poorly defended. Monks with no military training, isolated locations, often no walls at all. A monastery might hold the wealth equivalent of 20 villages but have 1/10 the defenders. The mathematics were irresistible. Church buildings themselves advertised their wealth. The larger and more ornate the structure, the richer the treasures inside. Raiders learned to identify valuable targets from a distance. Stone construction meant wealthy patrons. Bell towers meant bronze or iron to loot. Multiple buildings meant established communities with accumulated goods. This calculus of predation was refined over decades of raiding. What made target selection truly dark was the routine torture for intelligence. It wasn't enough to know a monastery existed. Raiders needed to know about hidden treasures, underground storage, valuables buried during earlier raids. Monks and priests were specifically targeted for this information. They'd be tortured systematically. Beatings, burning, mutilation, until they revealed where the most valuable items were concealed. Even after cooperating, they'd often be killed anyway to prevent them warning nearby settlements. Local informants faced similar fates. Some villages had residents who'd betray their neighbours in exchange for their own lives, leading raiders to hidden wealth or undefended communities. These collaborators were invariably killed once their usefulness ended. Couldn't risk them informing English authorities about raiding party numbers, tactics, or planned retreat routes. The burning of Lindisfarne in 793 CE stands as the archetypal example. The monastery was isolated on an island, wealthy from centuries of donations, completely undefended. The raiders arrived at dawn, encountering no resistance. What followed was methodical brutality. Monks tortured for information about treasure locations, then killed. Some were drowned in the sea, some had their throats cut, some were left alive but mutilated as warnings. The church was ransacked systematically, every hiding place checked, stones pried up looking for buried silver. The raid netted enormous wealth and taught Vikings a crucial lesson. Churches were profitable, and God apparently didn't protect his servants. More raids on monasteries followed immediately. It's important to strip away the romanticisation of Viking raids. This wasn't warfare between armies, not noble combat between equals. It was calculated terrorism, selecting the most vulnerable targets and extracting maximum wealth through maximum violence. Modern definitions of terrorism, using violence and fear against civilians to achieve strategic goals, fit Viking raiding perfectly. They weren't warriors. They were armed robbers who happened to use boats. The target selection process reveals the cold calculus. Profit margins measured in silver against investment of time and risk of death, with human suffering as merely a tool for information extraction. That's the boring history they don't put in movies. Chapter 7. The Battle Gear Reality. The image of Viking raiders in popular culture, gleaming chainmail, horned helmets, well-forged swords, bears almost no resemblance to reality. The vast majority of raiders had no armour whatsoever. Most wore the same clothes they farmed in: wool tunics, leather shoes, or boots if lucky, cloth wrapped around legs, a leather cap, or padded cloth coif if you were fortunate. The idea that common raiders wore mail is absurd. A single mail shirt required thousands of iron rings, hundreds of hours of skilled labour, and cost more than a farm. Archaeological evidence from mass graves suggests maybe 1 in 20 raiders had actual armour. The rest fought and died in regular clothing against English defenders who might have proper equipment. Protection for most men meant a wooden shield and prayers. These shields were circular, typically 3 feet in diameter, made from planks held together with iron or hide glue, with an iron boss in the centre to protect the hand grip. They worked reasonably well against initial blows but splintered quickly under sustained attack. Axes chopped through them, swords split the wood, spear points punched through. A shield might last 5 minutes in active combat before becoming useless. Then you had nothing between you and English steel but layers of wool. Weapons varied by wealth. Spears and axes were common, relatively cheap to make, effective in close combat. Swords were luxury items, often named and passed down through families, worth more than horses. Most raiders carried axes they'd used for farm work, spears they'd sharpened from wood and scavenged iron. What made this lack of protection catastrophic was the nature of combat injuries. When an axe hits unprotected flesh, it cuts to bone. When a spear thrusts into a chest covered only by cloth, it goes straight through. Arrow wounds struck unarmoured men with horrific effect, not the quick deaths of movies, but penetrating injuries to limbs, torsos, faces. Men fought with arrows still embedded in their bodies until blood loss or organ damage dropped them. Field treatment was crude. Pull out the projectile, cauterize the wound with hot iron, wrap it with torn cloth, hope infection doesn't set in. Spoiler: infection almost always set in. Even successful raids produced men who die slowly over the next week from septic wounds that modern antibiotics would cure in days. Mass graves from Viking raids tell brutal stories. Skeletons show defensive wounds on forearms and hands, evidence of men trying to ward off blows with no armour, no shields, just desperation. Skull fractures from axes or mace blows, severed limbs from sword strikes, ribs cut clean through by downward cuts. One grave in England contains 17 males of fighting age, all showing violent trauma, buried in a hasty pit. Forensic analysis suggested they were Vikings who died in a single engagement, probably a raid gone wrong. The wounds tell the story: blows to unprotected heads, slashes to unarmoured limbs, killing wounds that armour might have deflected or absorbed. These men died not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked equipment. They were farmers in tunics fighting trained soldiers in mail. Movies show armoured Vikings clashing with English forces in epic battles. both sides gleaming with metal and leather. Reality was far more one-sided. English thanes and their professional warriors often had proper gear: mail shirts, iron helmets, well-made weapons. They faced raiders who might own a single axe and a questionable shield. The combat was less epic battle and more slaughter of under-equipped farmers. We imagine Vikings as fearsome warriors, but strip away the mythology and see the truth. Desperate men in regular clothes, carrying farm tools modified for killing, betting their lives that speed and surprise would overcome their lack of protection. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. And when it didn't, they died in ways armour might have prevented. But armour cost silver they didn't have, which was why they were raiding in the first place. The circular logic of poverty and violence, boring and tragic in equal measure. Chapter 8. The shield-wall collision. When two forces met in open combat, they typically formed shield walls, lines of men, holding shields edge to edge, creating a defensive barrier. The Anglo-Saxons excelled at this formation. Vikings used it too when circumstances allowed. Picture two lines of armed men, maybe 30 yards apart, shields raised, weapons ready. The moment before, collision was pure psychological warfare. Screaming, cursing, banging weapons against shields, trying to break the enemy's nerve. Some men would piss themselves from fear. This was normal, expected, not shameful. Then someone gave the order, and both lines advanced toward each other. The walking turned to running in the final yards, then impact. The shield wall collision was unlike any modern combat. These men fought at arm's length, close enough to smell their opponent's breath, see the fear in their eyes, feel their blood spray when you struck. The front rank pushed their shields forward while thrusting spears between gaps, hooking axes over shield rims to pull them down, stabbing swords at exposed legs or faces. The ranks behind pushed forward, adding their weight to the line, preventing retreat, stabbing over shoulders at the enemy front. It was shoving, match and slaughter combined. Men in the front rank couldn't retreat even if they wanted to. Their own side pushed from behind while the enemy pushed from ahead. You were trapped in the killing zone until you broke through or died. What made the front rank position nightmarish was the mortality rate. Studies of shield wall combat suggest front rank fighters had roughly 30 seconds to 2 minutes of life expectancy once walls met, depending on the intensity. That's not hyperbole. That's the mathematical reality of close quarters combat with edge weapons. Men would be struck down, collapsing where they stood, and the ranks behind would step over their bodies or on them, maintaining the line. The second rank fighter, who just stepped into the front rank position now, had the same 30-second clock. It was rotation through a meat grinder. Some battles lasted hours. The front rank position rotated through dozens of men as casualties mounted. Bodies piled between the shield walls, creating obstacles, making footing treacherous. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the Battle of Ashdown in 871 CE with remarkable clarity. The account mentions blood flowing like rivers and men falling thick as hail. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's literal description of shield wall carnage. Another account describes warriors trampled into the mud by their own comrades. Men in the front rank weren't just killed by the enemy, they were crushed between the two forces, suffocated under fallen bodies, trampled to death by their own side pushing forward. Sometimes the shield walls would lock in stalemate for minutes or hours, both sides pushing, neither giving ground, while men in the front died slowly from accumulated wounds, pinned upright by the press of bodies, unable to fall. We sanitize ancient warfare in museums and textbooks, talking about tactics and formations as if they were chess moves. Strip that away and see what it really was. Mutual slaughter at arm's length. Men packed so tightly they couldn't fall when killed. The smell of blood and shit and fear. Screaming that never stopped. Weapons punching through shields and flesh and bone. knowing you had seconds to kill the man in front of you before someone killed you. No radios, no clear commands once combat started, no medical evacuation. Just push and stab and die until one side's nerve broke and men started fleeing, which usually meant dying with spears in their backs instead of in their chests. The Vikings who survived shield wall combat weren't superior warriors. They were lucky survivors of statistical horror, and they'd have to do it again at the next raid, and the next until luck ran out, which it always did eventually. Chapter 9. The Berserker Myth. The Berserker legend looms large in Viking mythology. Warriors who fought in trance-like fury, impervious to pain, stronger than normal men, immune to fear. Sagas describe them biting their shields, attacking with superhuman strength, wearing bear or wolf skins instead of armour. The reality was considerably darker and more pathetic. Modern research suggests berserker behaviour likely resulted from deliberate consumption of psychoactive substances combined with ritualistic preparation and severe mental trauma. They weren't blessed warriors. They were drugged men sent into battle in altered states of consciousness, often with catastrophic results for themselves and those around them. The most plausible explanation involves henbane or fly agaric mushrooms, both available in Scandinavia, both producing effects consistent with berserker descriptions. Henbane causes hallucinations, aggression, reduced pain perception and numbness. Fly agaric produces similar effects with additional spiritual delusion. Warriors would consume these substances before battle, perhaps mixed with alcohol, working themselves into rage through chanting, hyperventilation, and group psychology. The ritual preparation served dual purposes: actually induce altered states and create social pressure to perform the expected behaviour. Once the drugs took effect, these men would charge into combat in what appeared to be fearless fury. In reality, they simply couldn't process fear or pain normally. The chemicals hijacked their nervous systems. What made berserker behaviour truly dangerous was the lack of control. The sagas admit this indirectly. Stories of berserkers attacking their own crews after battle, unable to distinguish friend from enemy in their drug-fueled state. They'd have to be physically restrained, tied up, sometimes beaten unconscious by their own companions until the drugs wore off. During battle, they might charge at inappropriate times, breaking formation, getting themselves killed and endangering the coordinated attack. The supposed advantage of fearlessness was offset by the disadvantage of complete tactical chaos, and after the drugs wore off, the crash was severe. Exhaustion, hallucinations, paranoia, sometimes death from toxin overdose. These weren't elite troops. They were sacrificial shock troops whose value came from terrifying the enemy, not from combat effectiveness. Archaeological and written evidence provides glimpses of these casualties. Ibn Fadlan's account of meeting Rus Vikings mentions warriors who seemed possessed before battle, some of whom died afterward as if poisoned. Medieval texts describe warriors foaming at the mouth, convulsing, dying hours after combat ended, symptoms consistent with poisoning. The practice declined in later Viking age, perhaps because its costs outweighed benefits. Christian conversion also played a role. The Church explicitly condemned berserker practices as demonic. By the 11th century, the phenomenon had largely disappeared, remembered more in saga than practice. It's tempting to view berserkers as fearsome super warriors, the special forces of the Viking age. Reality was sadder. Traumatized men consuming toxic substances to override normal human survival instincts, encouraged by commanders who valued their shock value more than their lives. They were chemical weapons pointed at the enemy and at themselves simultaneously. Modern militaries have used similar tactics: amphetamines issued to soldiers in W. Wood, cocaine in various conflicts, alcohol before charges. The pattern repeats: temporary advantage in combat readiness offset by long-term damage and unpredictable behaviour. The berserker wasn't a hero from legend, but a cautionary tale about the costs of chemical warfare. Boring in its predictability across centuries, Humans keep discovering that drugging soldiers to fight harder works briefly and fails catastrophically, then forgetting and trying again. The Vikings learned this lesson 1,000 years ago. We're still learning it. Chapter 10. The looting process. After combat came the actual business of raiding, systematic looting under extreme time pressure. English response forces, fyrds, local militias, then retinues were converging on the raid location. Smoke from burning buildings served as a beacon visible for miles. Raiders had maybe 2 to 4 hours to search, seize, and retreat before being surrounded. The looting process wasn't casual browsing. It was controlled chaos with life or death urgency. Every minute spent searching was a minute closer to being cut off from your ships. Captains had to balance maximum plunder extraction against timing the retreat before the trap closed. The looting followed a brutal logic. First priority, obvious wealth, church altar goods, noble manor treasures, merchant stores. These were gathered quickly by designated men while others kept watch. Second priority, hidden valuables. This meant tearing apart buildings, digging up floors, checking rafters, interrogating survivors. Villagers who'd buried silver or hidden family treasures were forced, through threats or violence against children, to reveal locations. Torture for treasure information was standard procedure, executed with pragmatic efficiency. Third priority, portable trade goods, cloth, metalwork, tools, weapons, anything with resale value in Dublin or Scandinavia. Finally, captives for the slave market. Young women and children were roped together, gagged to prevent screaming. Elderly and sick captives were killed immediately. No resale value would slow retreat. What made looting darkest was the systematic use of children as leverage. If a family refused to reveal hidden wealth, the raiders would threaten or harm the children while parents watched. This wasn't sadism, though sadists certainly participated. It was functional terrorism. Break the parents' resistance fast by attacking what they valued most. The archaeology bears witness. Excavated Anglo-Saxon hoards from church floors, buried in such haste that valuable items were thrown in with dirt and debris. These were panic burials when raiders approached, desperate attempts to save something for a future that often never came. Many hoards stayed buried forever, their owners killed in the raid or never able to return safely. One particularly haunting example. Archaeologists excavating a monastery site in Northumbria found a silver hoard under the church floor, chalices, reliquaries, arm rings, coins. Carbon dating placed it to the mid-800s, right in the peak raiding period. The hoard was buried in chaos, items jumbled together, one chalice dented as if thrown rather than placed, silver mixed with plain stones in the rush. The hole was never reopened. Everyone who knew its location presumably died in the raid. The silver sat untouched for 11 centuries, a monument to looting that succeeded from the raiders' perspective but failed from the monks' perspective. They hid their treasures well enough that looters missed them, but not well enough to ever reclaim them. Imagine having minutes to grab what you can carry while your home burns and armed men search for you and your children. Imagine choosing between revealing your buried savings to prevent your daughter being hurt, or staying silent and hoping they'll leave. Imagine being the raider making these calculations. Is more torture worth the time cost? How much longer until English forces arrive? Is this child's life worth 3 more minutes of searching? These were the boring, brutal logistics of Viking raiding. Spreadsheet calculations with human suffering as inputs. Not glorious, not honourable, not the stuff of legends. Just men reducing other humans to problems to solve and assets to transport, measuring lives in silver weights, operating under time pressure that made mercy a luxury they couldn't afford. The silver paid for farms back home, fed families, secured futures. The cost was measured in trauma distributed across England, written in buried hoards and burned buildings and empty cradles. Chapter 11. The Captive Economy. Viking raiding wasn't just about silver and gold. Human beings were valuable cargo, perhaps more profitable than precious metals. The slave trade formed a crucial part of raid economics, with Dublin serving as the primary market where captives from England, Ireland and Scotland were bought and sold. Raiders evaluated potential captives with cold calculation. Young women brought premium prices, children were valuable but required feeding, healthy men could be sold as labourers, elderly were worthless. This wasn't impulsive violence but economic strategy. Human trafficking as business model, refined over decades of practice. The selection process was ruthlessly efficient. After a successful raid, captives would be assessed for market value. Women between roughly 15 and 30 years old were prime merchandise. Desirability for domestic slavery, concubinage, or forced marriage made them highly valuable. Children above age 7 or 8 but below 15 were also sought. Old enough to work, young enough to be controlled and trained. Healthy adult males could be sold for labour, but were considered risky, stronger, more likely to rebel or escape. The elderly, the sick, the disabled, these were killed immediately. They had negative value, consuming food without resale potential. Infants were particularly problematic. Crying revealed raiding party positions, required constant care, had no immediate value. Many infants were killed in front of their mothers, or mothers were forced to abandon them, or both mother and infant were killed if the mother wouldn't separate quietly. What made the captive experience truly horrific was the transportation. Captives were roped together by the neck or wrists, creating a human chain that moved only as fast as its slowest member. They'd be force-marched back to the ships, miles of walking while tied together, without food or water, beaten if they stumbled. Anyone who fell and couldn't get up was cut free from the line and left behind, usually with a fatal wound to prevent them warning English pursuers. Once at the ships, captives were packed into already crowded vessels, adding 15 to 30 humans to boats already crammed with raiders and plunder. The return voyage was nightmare. Captives often kept below deck in the bilge, in darkness, in human waste, seasick and terrified for 3 to 5 days. Some died during crossing, from exposure, from injury, from despair. Their bodies would be thrown overboard. Irish annals provide fragmentary glimpses of this horror. One entry describes a slave ship capsizing in rough weather, with captives chained together in the hold. They all drowned while the crew swam free. Another account mentions raiders selling 140 captives in Dublin from a single successful raid season, meaning hundreds more had been taken but died, were killed or escaped during transport. Archaeological evidence from Dublin's excavations show slave trade infrastructure, auction blocks, holding pens, chains and fetters in quantity. This wasn't occasional opportunistic slaving. It was industrial-scale human trafficking. We use the abstract term human trafficking as if it's primarily a modern problem, something that happens elsewhere to other people. Strip away that distance and see what it meant. Families torn apart forever, children sold away from parents, women repeatedly raped during and after capture, men worked to death in foreign lands. The Viking slave trade operated for 2 centuries, trafficking tens of thousands of people through markets that functioned as openly as fish markets. The boring truth about evil is how banal it becomes when economically incentivized. Slavery wasn't an unfortunate side effect of raiding, but a core profit mechanism, calculated in pounds of silver per human being. And everyone involved, from the raiders to the ship captains to the Dublin merchants to the buyers, participated in the same market logic that turned people into commodity units. The math was simple, and the suffering was enormous, and neither fact prevented the system from operating efficiently for generations. Chapter 12. The wounded reality combat wounds in the Viking Age meant agony without relief. There was no morphine, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. When a raider took a serious injury, axe to the limb, spear through the torso, sword cut to the face, their survival depended on crude field medicine performed by men with no medical training using contaminated tools. The treatment was often worse than the initial injury, and survival rates were abysmal for anything beyond superficial wounds. Modern soldiers in combat zones have trauma surgeons, medevac helicopters, blood transfusions, sterile operating rooms. Viking raiders had strips of cloth torn from dead men's clothing and blades heated in campfires. Picture the immediate aftermath of a shield wall battle. The English have been driven off or have retreated, leaving the field littered with dead and wounded from both sides. You're among the lucky raiders still standing, and now comes the grim work of triage. Men with minor cuts, shallow slashes to arms or legs, get basic bandaging and are expected to keep moving. Men with serious but potentially survivable wounds, deep cuts, broken bones from impacts, get crude treatment. Arrows or spear points still embedded in flesh need to be removed. You brace the wounded man, grip the shaft and pull. If the point is barbed, you push it through and out the other side rather than pulling back. The screaming is constant and terrible. Then comes cauterization. A blade or poker heated in fire until glowing, then pressed into the wound to burn it closed. The smell of burning human flesh mingles with blood and shit on the battlefield. What made survival so unlikely was infection. Every weapon, every bandage, every hand that touched wounds was contaminated with bacteria. Wound infections were essentially guaranteed. Within days, injuries would become inflamed, swollen, oozing pus. Gangrene was common, tissue death spreading from the wound site, turning flesh black and putrid, the distinctive sweet rot smell that everyone recognised as death approaching. The only treatment for gangrenous limbs was amputation. Hold the man down, use an axe or sword to chop through the limb, cauterise the stump, hope he doesn't bleed out or die from shock. No one survived torso wounds that penetrated the body cavity. If your guts were exposed, you died slowly over days from infection and internal bleeding. Skull fractures, crushed ribs, spinal injuries, all death sentences just drawn out. The severely wounded presented brutal decisions. A man with both legs shattered, unable to walk, requiring 4 men to carry him. He'd slow down the retreat, consume resources, and would probably die anyway. Companions faced the choice: abandon him to die alone, or mercy kill him quickly. The sagas occasionally reference this directly. Ibn Fadlan's account describes a wounded Rus warrior asking his companion to kill him rather than leave him for enemies. The companion obliged. A sword thrust through the heart was quicker and kinder than abandoning him to English revenge or slow death from injuries. These weren't villains making these choices. They were men operating under impossible constraints where mercy looked like murder. Modern military medicine saves people who would have been unsavable throughout most of human history. Severed limbs can be reattached, damaged organs repaired, blood loss compensated with transfusions, infections treated with antibiotics. A wound that might mean death or permanent disability 1,000 years ago might mean a few weeks of recovery today. Viking raiders had none of these advantages. They fought knowing that any serious injury likely meant death, if not immediately, then slowly from infection over the next week. And there was nothing morphine or codeine could do about the pain, nothing to dull the agony of wounds or treatment. You endured or you didn't. Most didn't. The ones who survived serious wounds often wished they hadn't, as the next chapter will explore. But in that immediate aftermath of combat, surrounded by screaming wounded and the stench of cauterization, survival was victory enough, even if that survival was temporary, infected, and guaranteed to get worse. Chapter 13. The English Resistance. The common narrative portrays Vikings raiding helpless English villages and monasteries with impunity, but this was only true for a brief window, roughly 789 to 850 CE. After that, England developed sophisticated counter-raiding strategies that turned the tables dramatically. King Alfred the Great's military reforms, implemented in the 870s, 880s, created systematic defences that made raiding increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. The English learned quickly, adapted, tactically, and ultimately made Viking raiding so costly that the era of hit-and-run attacks gave way to invasion attempts and permanent settlement. But the transition period, when raiders expected easy targets and instead found organised resistance, produced catastrophic losses. Alfred's key innovation was the burh system, fortified towns strategically placed so that no location in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a defended position. These weren't elaborate castles, but practical fortifications, earth ramparts, wooden palisades, manned by local fyrds. The system created a network effect. Raiders who landed on the coast found their inland targets protected, or their retreat route cut off by militia forces mobilised from nearby burhs. Beacon towers allowed rapid communication. A raid spotted on the coast triggered warnings throughout the region within hours. Local fyrds could assemble and respond before raiders finished looting. The window of opportunity that made raiding profitable shrank from 12 hours to 4, then to 2, then closed entirely in some regions. What made English resistance truly brutal was their lack of mercy. The romanticised view of medieval warfare with ransom and honour didn't extend to Vikings. They were viewed as heathen pirates deserving no quarter. Captured raiders were hanged, mutilated as warnings, or buried alive. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records these punishments matter-of-factly, without apology or explanation. It was simply understood. If you came to raid English territory and were caught, you died badly. This psychological warfare worked. Raiders who survived encounters with organised English defence returned to their crews with stories of overwhelming resistance, coordinated tactics, and brutal executions. The risk-reward calculus shifted dramatically. The Battle of Buttington in 893 CE demonstrates the evolved English tactics. A Viking raiding force had moved up the Severn River, becoming isolated inland. English forces from multiple burhs converged, surrounding the raiders and besieging their temporary camp. The Vikings were trapped, couldn't retreat to their ships, couldn't fight through the English forces, couldn't resupply. After weeks of siege, they attempted a breakout. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the result with brutal clarity. English forces slaughtered them by the hundreds as they fled. The field was littered with bodies like sheaves of wheat after harvest. Survivors who reached the ships were too few to crew them effectively, and many more died on the return voyage. It was a complete catastrophe. An entire raiding expedition annihilated. We think of Vikings as unstoppable raiders who terrorised England for centuries, but the reality had phases. The early raids succeeded because they exploited unpreparedness and disorganisation. Once the English adapted, creating standing defences, organised militias, rapid response systems, the dynamic reversed. Raiders went from hunters to hunted, from predators to prey. The English defenders matched Viking brutality with their own, showing that civilised Christian kingdoms could be just as ruthless as barbaric pagans when defending their territory. By the late 800s, successful raids required larger forces, better intelligence, more sophisticated tactics, essentially professional armies rather than opportunistic raiding parties. The age of small-scale hit-and-run raids was ending, not from Viking choice, but from English innovation that made such raids suicidally dangerous. Boring military evolution, written in the bodies of raiders who bet on outdated tactics and lost everything. Chapter 14. The Ship Guard Duty. While raiding parties marched inland seeking plunder, someone had to stay behind and guard the ships, the escape route, the supplies, the only way home. Shipguard duty meant being left on an English beach with a skeleton crew, maybe 10 to 15 men watching over vessels meant for 50, vulnerable to English counterattacks, missing out on plunder shares, and dealing with the psychological torture of waiting. It combined the worst aspects of military service: danger without glory, boredom punctuated by terror, exclusion from the rewards you'd risk the journey to earn. The men chosen for shipguard were typically the wounded from the crossing, the sick, the least trusted, or those who'd angered the captain. It was simultaneously essential duty and punishment detail. The strategic vulnerability was obvious. English coastal communities learned that Viking ships beached and lightly guarded were high-value targets. Burn the ships, and you've trapped the entire raiding party inland, where they could be surrounded and destroyed by converging militia forces. Chronicles record multiple instances of English villagers attacking beached Viking vessels, killing the guards, and burning ships. The psychological effect on shipguards was constant tension, scanning the horizon for approaching English forces, knowing that 10 men couldn't defend against a determined attack by 50 or 100 militia members. Sleep came in shifts, never deeply, always with weapons ready. Days could pass with no word from the inland raiding party. Were they successful, captured, dead? The guards had no way of knowing. What made shipguard particularly bitter was the plunder distribution. Shipguards typically received half shares or quarter shares compared to active raiders, justified by not participating in actual combat. This created deep resentment. You'd endured the brutal sea crossing, risked English attack while guarding the ships, and watched your companions return laden with silver while you received a fraction despite equal risk. Arguments over this were common and sometimes violent. The resentment was compounded when guards realised they'd been chosen for weakness, unable to fight effectively due to injury or illness, or for being expendable if the ships were attacked. You were, simultaneously, too valuable to lose, someone had to guard, and too worthless to include in the real work. Archaeological evidence tells the grim story of failed ship guards. Excavations along English coasts have found burned Viking ship remains with human bones intermixed. Guards who died when English forces attacked and burned the vessels. One site in East Anglia revealed a gnar deliberately fired with at least 12 bodies inside, analysis suggesting they were killed before or during the burning. The ship's cargo of plunder and supplies was scattered, looted by whoever destroyed the vessel. No saga records their names. No memorial marks their deaths. They simply disappeared from history, reduced to anonymous bones in a burned boat. Consider the psychological hell of shipguard duty. You're on an enemy shore, cut off from your main force, with insufficient men to defend effectively, watching both the inland direction for your returning companions and the coastal direction for English attacks. You're excluded from the glory and plunder that justified the entire trip. You're probably injured or sick. That's why you were chosen for this duty. And you know from stories and from experience that shipguards are favourite targets for English revenge. Some raids never returned. The inland party was killed or captured, and shipguards waited for weeks before accepting they were stranded in enemy territory and attempting the crossing home undermanned. Others returned to find their ships burned and guards dead. The lucky ones simply experienced boredom, resentment and partial payment. But luck was rare in Viking raiding, and shipguard duty was where all the injustices of the raiding economy became concentrated. Danger without reward, responsibility without respect, the risk of death with none of the potential for glory. That's the boring reality. Even within raiding parties, there was hierarchy and exploitation, and someone always got the worst of every bad situation. Chapter 15. The distribution of plunder. After a successful raid came the moment raiders had risked everything for, dividing the loot. This should have been the triumphant culmination, the payoff for crossing seas and fighting battles and watching friends die. Instead, it was often where raiding parties tore themselves apart. The distribution of plunder was governed by elaborate rules that were routinely bent, manipulated, or outright violated. trust broke down precisely when stakes were highest. More raiders probably died in disputes over silver distribution than in some actual raids. The boring truth about human nature: when large amounts of wealth concentrate in lawless situations, violence follows inevitably. The theoretical distribution hierarchy was clear. The Jarl or expedition leader took first choice and the largest share, often 1/4 to 1/3 of total value. Ship captains took next shares. Then came warriors who'd participated in combat with shares, theoretically equal but actually variable based on combat performance, social status, and personal relationships with leadership. Ship guards got reduced shares. Slaves and thralls got nothing. They'd be sold separately. But theory and practice diverged wildly. Leaders could cheat by undervaluing total haul before distribution, claiming a third that was actually half. They could reserve particularly valuable items, jewelled weapons, fine cloth, high-value captives, for themselves before division. And once distribution happened, accusations of hidden loot spread immediately. What made plunder disputes deadly was the combination of exhaustion, trauma, and greed. Men returning from raids had experienced extreme stress, watched friends die, killed people themselves, endured privation and fear. They were psychologically unstable and heavily armed. Their promised reward, the reason for all that suffering, was now being divided, and they watched with paranoid intensity to ensure they weren't being cheated. If someone produced more silver than seemed justified by their assigned share, accusations followed. You hid loot during the raid. You stole from the common pile. You kept back valuable items. These accusations led to fights, and fights between armed, traumatized men led to deaths. The sagas are full of blood feuds that started over disputed plunder shares. The economics of hidden loot created prisoners' dilemma situations. If everyone reported all their loot honestly, total distribution would be fair. But if you hid some, a silver armring in your tunic, coins in your shoes, and got away with it, you gained significantly. The problem? Everyone knew this logic, so everyone assumed everyone else was cheating, which justified cheating yourself. Trust spiraled down to zero. Raiders would be searched before distribution, sometimes violently. Accusations of theft led to torture within the raiding party. The same methods used on English captives now turned inward. Men who couldn't produce missing silver they'd never actually taken would be beaten, killed, their remaining shares seized. The paranoia was self-fulfilling. The belief that everyone was cheating made everyone cheat, which validated the belief. The saga literature hints at the long-term consequences. Blood feuds starting from disputed plunder shares lasted generations, families killing each other over grievances from raids decades past. One account describes a feud that started when one raider accused another of hiding a gold chalice. The accused man killed the accuser, the accuser's brother killed the accused, and the cycle continued through 3 generations, eventually involving dozens of deaths. All over a chalice that may never have existed. The boring horror of human conflict. We can cooperate effectively to commit violence against outsiders, but consistently fail to cooperate in distributing the rewards, destroying ourselves over divisions that careful accounting could prevent. We like to imagine Viking raiders as loyal brotherhoods, bands of brothers facing danger together. Strip away that romance and see the reality. Temporary alliances of desperate men held together by force and greed, immediately fracturing when the unifying threat disappeared and wealth appeared. They were loyal to each other only so long as loyalty served individual interest, and they were armed and traumatized and operating in legal grey zones where murder had no consequences beyond immediate retaliation. The distribution of plunder revealed the core truth. These weren't noble warriors, but competitors in a zero-sum game. And the game was rigged, and everyone knew it, and people died over it constantly. That's the history no one wants to teach, not the glory of battle, but the pathetic violence over money, the predictable collapse of cooperation when actual rewards materialized. boring, tragic, and repeated throughout human history whenever plunder mixes with weapons and insufficient oversight. Chapter 16. The Return Journey. The return voyage was often more dangerous than the outbound crossing for one simple reason: overloading. Raiders had arrived in vessels designed for 50 men plus minimal supplies. They returned with the same 50 men, or fewer if casualties were high, plus looted silver, church treasures, captured slaves, weapons seized from fallen enemies, food stolen from settlements, and wounded who needed space to lie down rather than row. The ships rode lower in the water, making them more vulnerable to waves and storms. Every extra pound decreased freeboard, the distance between waterline and deck edge, and increased the risk of swamping. The mathematics of carrying capacity collided with the greed of successful raids, and water always won the physics argument. Picture a Nar departing English shores after a successful raid in 872 CE. The vessel is packed, 60 people including 20 captives, several wounded men unable to help with rowing or sailing, sacks of looted grain, barrels of salted meat, bundles of cloth, leather goods, metalwork, and church treasures wrapped in stolen vestments. The ship that rode high and agile on the journey over now sits heavy and sluggish in the water. As the crew rows out past the breakers, waves that previously washed over the bow now crash onto the deck, soaking everyone and everything. The bilge, normally kept relatively dry through bailing, now constantly fills with seawater. Men must bail continuously just to stay afloat. The wounded groan with each wave impact. The captives, roped together in the bilge, are submerged in cold, fouled water, with each wave that breaks over the side. What made overloaded return voyages catastrophic was the storm risk. North Sea weather in late spring and summer could turn violent with little warning. A storm that an unloaded vessel might weather successfully became a death sentence for an overloaded one. When waves started coming over the rails with every swell, crews faced brutal decisions: lighten the load or sink. The hierarchy of what got thrown overboard revealed raiding priorities with brutal clarity. First, overboard, captives. They were valuable, but survival was more valuable. Slaves roped together would be cut free and pushed over the side, drowning while chained together, screaming until water filled their lungs. Second overboard, wounded who couldn't row. Harsh calculation, dead weight. They'd be thrown over, sometimes alive, sometimes mercy killed first. Third overboard, bulk goods, grain, cloth, anything heavy without concentrated value. Finally, if the ship was still in danger, even silver, even church treasures. Better to survive poor than die rich. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records instances of Viking ships found drifting, empty or with dead crews, treasure still aboard. These were vessels that somehow stayed afloat after everyone died. From exposure, from starvation when blown off course, from disease. One account describes a Nar washing ashore in Sussex with 15 dead men still at their rowing positions, stiff from rigor mortis, coins scattered in the bilge. They'd made it so close to safety before succumbing. Another chronicle entry mentions coastal villagers finding bodies washing up for weeks after a storm. Raiders who drowned when their overloaded vessels capsized, weighted down by looted treasures in their pockets, sinking to the seabed still clutching stolen chalices. We understand intellectually that greed has consequences, but there's something particularly stark about raiders drowning because they overloaded their escape vehicle with loot. The fatal mathematics of carrying capacity played out in storms with no second chances. Modern shipping has load limits, safety regulations, weather forecasting, Coast Guard rescues. Viking raiders had eyeball estimates, storm reading skills that worked until they didn't, and the North Sea's complete indifference to their ambitions. Some raids succeeded in every phase: landing, combat, looting, only to end in drowning during retreat because they got too greedy with cargo. The treasure reached the seabed instead of Scandinavia, enriching neither raiders nor victims, just feeding fish and eventually archaeologists. That's boring history. Sometimes the biggest danger isn't the enemy, but simple physics and human overconfidence in carrying capacity. The water doesn't care about your bravery or your need for silver. It just calculates weight versus displacement, and when the equation fails, everyone drowns equally. Chapter 17. The disease factor. While combat gets the attention in Viking raiding stories, disease killed more men than English swords in many campaigns. The combination of crowded ships, contaminated water, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and stress created perfect conditions for epidemic illness. Dysentery was the constant companion, but ship fever, likely typhus spread by body lice, periodically devastated raiding parties. Scurvy emerged on longer campaigns when fresh food ran out. Wound infections spread through the group as contaminated tools and bandages moved from man to man. And raiders had no immunity to English diseases, just as the English had no immunity to Scandinavian ones. The biological exchange worked both ways, with mortality on all sides. The mechanics of disease transmission in raiding parties were straightforward and brutal. 50 to 70 men packed into a 50-foot vessel, wearing the same clothes for weeks, unable to bathe, sharing water barrels that became contaminated with backwash from every mouth that drank from them. Body lice spread from person to person through the cramped contact. Fleas from rats in the bilge bit everyone indiscriminately. When one man contracted dysentery, from bad water, bad food, or another sufferer, the disease spread through the crew with terrifying speed. The contamination cycle was self-perpetuating. Sick men with diarrhea fouled the bilge water, which splashed on everyone, which spread the pathogens further. Within days, half the crew could be incapacitated with bloody flux, severe cramping, and dangerous dehydration. What made epidemic disease catastrophic was the inability to isolate or treat effectively. On land, you might quarantine the sick or move away from contaminated areas. On a boat in the North Sea, there was nowhere to go. Sick and healthy coexisted in the same cramped space, sharing everything, ensuring the disease passed to everyone eventually. Treatment options were non-existent. Prayer, folk remedies involving herbs that did nothing, and waiting to see who died. Dehydration from dysentery killed quickly when fresh water was limited. The cruel irony, surrounded by water, dying from thirst because drinking salt water or contaminated fresh water made the dysentery worse. Men would be thrown overboard when they died, sometimes before they died, if they were clearly terminal and taking up valuable space. The written sources occasionally mention disease-affecting campaigns. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a raid in Wessex that ended not from English resistance, but because a great pestilence killed so many raiders they couldn't maintain the campaign. Annals from Ireland describe a Viking warband that had to abandon a siege because sickness killed more than half their number. These fragmentary references hint at the scale, entire military operations ending not from combat defeats, but from biological disasters. The survivors who limped home carried diseases back to their own communities, spreading illness through Norse villages, a grim form of reverse raiding where the plunder was pathogens. It's worth reflecting on how much medieval warfare depended on disease resistance and basic hygiene. Two things Vikings completely lacked. Modern military medicine emphasizes field sanitation, clean water, vector control, vaccines, antibiotics. These innovations exist specifically because historical armies lost more soldiers to disease than combat throughout most of human history. The Vikings were no exception. They sailed in floating petri dishes, ate contaminated food, drank polluted water, and lived in conditions that guaranteed disease transmission. Then they wondered why so many raiders died without ever seeing combat. The boring truth: more men probably died shitting themselves in bilge water than died gloriously in shield walls. More raids failed from dysentery than from English tactics. The unglamorous diseases, diarrhoea, lice-borne fever, scurvy, infected wounds, killed reliably and frequently, without drama or saga-worthy deaths. Just men getting sick, getting weaker, and dying in filth far from home, their bodies thrown overboard to lighten the load. That's the war that history doesn't memorialise, but it was the war that most raiders actually experienced. Chapter 18. The Weather Gamble. Viking raiding was fundamentally constrained by seasonal weather patterns that created narrow windows of opportunity and enormous risks. The raiding season ran roughly from late April to early September, when North Sea conditions were merely dangerous rather than suicidal. Spring and summer offered longer daylight, warmer temperatures, and relatively calmer seas. But relatively calmer still meant storms that could appear with little warning, waves that could swamp vessels, winds that could blow ships off course for days. Autumn brought increasingly violent weather as Atlantic storm systems moved in. Winter was absolute suicide. Freezing temperatures, massive storms, short daylight hours, and survival rates approaching zero. Every raid was a bet against the calendar and the weather eventually won every bet. The risks of getting caught by weather were straightforward. A sudden storm mid-crossing meant fighting to keep the vessel afloat, bailing constantly, rowing desperately to maintain heading, and praying to whatever god seemed relevant. Waves could break over the ship continuously, filling it faster than crews could bail. Men would be washed overboard, disappearing into the grey chaos of storm seas with no possibility of rescue. The mast might break, the sail tear, leaving the vessel at the mercy of wind and current. Ships could be blown far off course, vessels aiming for England ending up in Scotland or back toward Norway, burning through food supplies, crews dying from exposure during the extended journey. Or the ship might simply founder, swamp completely, sink, everyone drowning in minutes. What made weather truly terrifying was the complete unpredictability and helplessness. Raiders had no weather forecasts, no satellite data, no radio contact with other vessels or shore. They read weather signs, cloud formations, wind direction, wave patterns, but these were educated guesses, not certainties. A raiding party might depart on a clear morning and encounter a storm by afternoon. The decision to raid in marginal weather was always a gamble. Stay and miss the opportunity or go and risk everything. Conservative captains who delayed for weather died poor. Aggressive captains who risked bad weather often just died. The survivors were lucky, not necessarily skilled, though survivors always interpreted their luck as skill. The chronicles and sagas provide glimpses of weather disasters. The most catastrophic example, the destruction of a major Viking supply fleet in the 870s during the Great Heathen Army's campaign. A storm caught the fleet, perhaps dozens of ships, hundreds or thousands of men, and devastated it. Ships were sunk, crews drowned, supplies lost. The army, expecting resupply, instead faced starvation and had to raid desperately for survival rather than conquest. Individual disasters went unrecorded. Ships that simply never arrived, presumed lost to weather, families waiting years before accepting their men weren't returning. Bodies would wash up on shores for weeks after major storms, drowned raiders still wearing their gear, silver still in their pockets, evidence of successful raids that ended in watery graves meters from safety. We check weather apps before deciding whether to bring an umbrella. We cancel flights for storms, reschedule trips for better conditions, have Coast Guard rescues and emergency services for maritime disasters. Vikings bet their lives on cloud formations and seabird behaviour, sailed in boats that offered no protection from elements, and died by the hundreds when their weather reading skills proved insufficient. More raiders died from weather, hypothermia, drowning, exposure, than from English armies. The North Sea killed indiscriminately. Experienced navigators and first-time raiders, wealthy jarls and poor farmers, all equally vulnerable to physics and meteorology. The boring reality is that nature defeated Vikings more reliably than any human enemy. Storms didn't care about your reputation, your skill, your desperation, or your family waiting at home. They just killed you if you were in the wrong place at wrong time with insufficient vessel, and the raiders, driven by economics and glory-seeking, kept betting against the weather, kept losing that bet, kept dying in storms that saga writers didn't bother recording because there was nothing heroic about drowning. Just bodies in the water, treasure on the seabed, and families back home who'd never know exactly what happened. Only that their men sailed away and never returned. Chapter 19. The Hierarchy Violence. Viking raiding parties weren't egalitarian brotherhoods of warriors. They were hierarchical power structures maintained through violence and intimidation. Captains and veteran warriors enforced their authority with beatings, humiliation, and occasionally murder. Younger or weaker crew members existed at the bottom of brutal pecking orders, subject to abuse that ranged from theft of their rations to sexual assault to being used as expendable scouts. The might makes right social structure meant that if you couldn't physically defend yourself or lacked powerful allies, you were prey for those above you. This internal violence weakened raiding parties but was considered necessary for discipline. The reality was often social Darwinism on boats. The strong preyed on the weak, and captains tolerated it as long as it didn't threaten overall mission effectiveness. The mechanics of hierarchy enforcement were straightforward. Infractions, real or invented, were punished with public beatings to demonstrate authority and terrorize others into compliance. Fail to row hard enough, get beaten. Question an order, get beaten. Show weakness or fear, get beaten and then targeted for further abuse. The beatings weren't controlled discipline but vicious attacks designed to inflict pain and humiliation. Men who fought back against higher-ranking crew members could be killed outright, thrown overboard with some excuse about falling, or swept away by waves. No one would contradict the captain's version of events. This created an atmosphere of terror that kept lower-ranking crew members compliant even when orders were stupid or suicidal. What made internal violence particularly dark was the exploitation of the weak. Young men on their first raids, those already wounded or sick, those without family connections or powerful friends, these became targets for systematic abuse. Their food would be stolen, forcing them to go hungry while others ate. Their equipment would be taken and borrowed without return. Some were sexually assaulted by more powerful crew members, with the violence tolerated or ignored by captains who didn't want to upset their veteran raiders. The victims had no recourse. Complaining to authority meant appealing to the same power structure that enabled the abuse. Fighting back meant death. Endurance was the only option, hoping to survive long enough to become strong enough to either defend yourself or join the abusers. The saga literature occasionally admits these realities indirectly. References to outlaws or landless men joining raids, then disappearing, killed by their own crew for their equipment, bodies thrown overboard, officially lost at sea. Accounts of disputes within raiding parties that ended in murders, with the survivors controlling the narrative. One saga mentions a young warrior whose death was blamed on English defenders, but whom other sources suggest was killed by his own captain over an insult. The truth was buried with him, literally. His body fed to the North Sea, his family back home receiving comfortable lies about his heroic death in battle. Modern military hazing and abuse have long histories, carefully documented cycles of violence within hierarchical organisations. Strip away modern oversight and legal consequences, take a group of violent men, put them in cramped spaces under enormous stress with weapons readily available, add desperation and greed and trauma, and internal violence becomes inevitable. Viking raiding parties were microcosms of this dysfunction. The same predatory hierarchies that exist in prisons, gangs, and militaries without effective oversight. The strong exploited the weak because they could, because it reinforced their status, because violence was their primary skill, and they applied it omnidirectionally. The boring truth: warriors celebrated for violence against enemies were also violent among themselves. The capacity for cruelty isn't directional. It's a trait that expresses itself against whoever is vulnerable and available. And on a Viking raiding ship, there were always vulnerable targets, and the violence flowed downhill from captain to veteran to new recruit, with the weakest bearing the accumulated brutality of everyone above them. That brotherhood of warriors was a myth even in its own time. The reality was a predatory hierarchy held together by fear, maintained by violence, and corroded from within by the same brutality it inflicted outward. Chapter 20. The Failed Raid. Not every raid succeeded. Some ended in catastrophic failures where raiders were trapped, slaughtered, or forced to abandon everything and flee. The factors that made raids fail were often the same ones that made them succeed, just reversed. Surprise worked against you when English forces had advance warning. Speed of attack meant nothing when defenders were already armed and positioned. Overwhelming force in small engagements became overwhelming disadvantage when fighting coordinated militia forces. And once a raid failed, once you were cut off from your ships surrounded by superior numbers or caught in an ambush, survival rates approached zero. English forces had learned that mercy toward Viking raiders accomplished nothing. Captured raiders were executed publicly, painfully, as warnings and revenge. The dynamics of a failed raid were nightmarish. Imagine a raiding party that's pushed inland to attack a monastery, expecting the usual light resistance. Instead, they find the monastery empty, evacuated after beacon warnings, and the English third converging from multiple directions. The raiders realise they're in a trap. The retreat toward the ships becomes a running battle through hostile territory. Men are picked off by arrows from tree lines, ambushed at river crossings, hunted through forests. The discipline that held during advance collapses during retreat. It becomes every man for himself. The wounded are abandoned. The slow are left behind. Personal survival trumps unit cohesion. Some raiders scatter into countryside, hoping to hide and eventually escape. Most are hunted down methodically over the following days. What made failed raids truly brutal was the English response to captured survivors. These weren't prisoners of war entitled to ransom or exchange. They were pirates, heathens, and murderers who'd be used as examples. Public hangings were common. Raiders strung up in market squares or outside churches they'd attacked, left to strangle slowly while crowds watched. Other executions were more creative. Burial alive, drowning in rivers with stones tied to feet, burning at stakes. Mutilation before execution was routine. Eyes gouged out, hands cut off, castration, both as punishment and as warnings to other potential raiders. The bodies would be displayed prominently, left to rot as visceral demonstrations of what awaited those who raided English territory. The disaster at Sinwit in 878 CE exemplifies the catastrophic failure scenario. A Viking force of perhaps 800 to 1200 men besieged a burh in Devon. English forces under Ealdorman Odda counterattacked, catching the raiders between the fortification and their own forces. The Vikings were slaughtered almost to a man. The Chronicle reports that there was killed the Jarl Ubba and 800 men with him. The survivors, if any, were few enough not to merit mention. The Vikings' raven banner, the famous symbol of conquest, was captured and displayed as English trophy. Entire raiding expeditions could be wiped out in single engagements once the tactical situation reversed. The plunder they'd gathered meant nothing. The risks they'd taken were wasted. The journey accomplished nothing except their own deaths in foreign soil, killed by people whose land they'd tried to steal. It's worth sitting with the psychology of failed raids, the moment when victory turns to defeat, when you realise you're going to die far from home for nothing. The panic as English forces close in, the desperate calculation of whether to fight hopelessly or flee and be hunted, the knowledge that if captured you'll face torture and public execution, your death used as entertainment and propaganda, the regret, all the small decisions that led to this trap, the raid you could have skipped, the warnings you ignored, the greed that pushed you inland despite the risks, and then the actual dying, speared while running away, shot down with arrows, overwhelmed by superior numbers, or captured and executed. No glory, no saga, no compensation for your family. Just failure and death, and a shallow grave in England or no grave at all. The gamble of raiding revealed its core truth in failure. The risks were always enormous, the rewards were never guaranteed, and when luck turned, when weather or tactics or intelligence went wrong, you lost everything including your life. That boring probability finally caught up with you, and the house won, and you died badly. That was the outcome for thousands of raiders whose names we'll never know, whose failed raids barely merit mentions in chronicles, whose families back home simply received word one day that the ships hadn't returned. The inglorious end that probably represented the most common outcome, not wealth and reputation, just disappearance into history's unmarked graves. Batch 5. Chapters 21-25. Target 3,000 words. Chapter 21. The psychological toll. The Viking Age had no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, no framework for understanding psychological injury, no treatment for what we'd recognise as combat trauma. Yet the evidence suggests raiders suffered the same mental health consequences that modern soldiers experience. Intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, violent outbursts, inability to reintegrate into civilian life. They'd witnessed horrific violence, participated in atrocities, watched friends die, killed people with their own hands, endured constant mortal danger, survived when others didn't. The human brain responds to these experiences predictably across centuries. What changed wasn't whether trauma occurred, but how societies understood and addressed it. Vikings had no understanding and no effective treatment, just damaged men returning to communities that expected them to resume normal life immediately. The psychological load accumulated with each raid. First-time raiders experienced the initial shock, the reality of violence versus imagination, the actual sensation of killing, the sight of mutilated bodies, the sounds of dying men. Many returned from first raids changed, quieter, more aggressive, prone to startling at sudden noises. Families noticed but had no framework to address it. Veterans of multiple raids showed progressively worse symptoms. Men who'd been on 5 or 6 raids might be unable to sleep through the night, prone to violent rage over minor provocations, socially withdrawn, or self-medicating with alcohol. The communities tolerated this to a point. These were warriors, after all, and some behavioural problems were expected. But severe cases became village problems. Men too dangerous to be around, too unpredictable to trust, too damaged to function in peacetime society. What made the psychological toll particularly dark was how it expressed itself. Some veterans became violent toward their own families. Domestic abuse driven by trauma, the hypervigilance and threat detection of combat applied to civilian interactions. A wife moving suddenly might trigger explosive reactions from a husband whose nervous system was permanently rewired for combat. Children learned to walk quietly around fathers who might erupt in violence if startled. Other veterans withdrew completely, unable to maintain social relationships, spending days or weeks alone, avoiding community gatherings. Some turned to raiding as escape, the only context where their symptoms felt normal, where hypervigilance was appropriate, where violence was expected. They became trapped in cycles, raid to escape peacetime dysfunction, experience more trauma, become less able to function peacefully, raid again. The Sega literature contains fragmentary hints of these struggles, references to warriors becoming difficult after returning from campaigns, to men who kept to themselves, to veterans whose families feared them or who died mysteriously young, possibly suicide, though sagas rarely named it explicitly. One account mentions a raider who returned wealthy but became increasingly unstable, eventually killed in a dispute that the saga portrays as his fault, but which reads like someone whose trauma responses led to confrontation. Archaeological evidence from burials shows some male skeletons with healed combat injuries buried in isolated locations, away from community cemeteries, possible evidence of social marginalisation. We've learned through modern research that combat trauma is universal. Soldiers from every army, every era, every culture experience psychological injury from exposure to violence and death. The Vikings weren't immune to human neurology. Their raiders came home damaged just like our veterans come home damaged. The difference was understanding and support. Modern soldiers have access to therapy, medication, support groups, disability recognition, and, at least theoretically, communities educated about trauma. Viking raiders had none of this. They suffered in isolation. Their communities attributed behavioural problems to character flaws or divine punishment, and they self-medicated with violence and alcohol or simply broke down completely. The boring truth: warfare has always destroyed minds along with bodies, and societies have always struggled to care for the damaged survivors. The specific symptoms vary less than the cultural frameworks for understanding them. 1,000 years ago, PTSD existed but was invisible. Just men acting strange, families suffering, communities dealing with returned warriors who'd left something essential behind on English beaches or in shield wall carnage. The psychological casualties outnumbered physical casualties, then as now, but only the visible wounds counted in saga accounting. Chapter 22. The Disabled Veteran. Surviving a raid with serious injuries meant returning home permanently damaged. Lost limbs, blinded eyes, facial disfigurement, chronic pain from poorly healed wounds. These were common outcomes for raiders who escaped death but not disability. In a subsistence agricultural society, physical disability meant economic catastrophe. Farming required full-body labour, ploughing, harvesting, building, repairs. A man who couldn't work was a burden on family resources, unable to contribute, consuming food he couldn't help produce. The silver earned from raiding might sustain him briefly, but silver runs out. The disability lasted forever. Raiders who'd risked everything to improve their economic position often returned worse off than before. Unable to work, unable to raid again, slowly draining family resources until nothing remained. The specific disabilities tell stories of violence and inadequate medical care. Missing hands from axe injuries, stumps poorly healed after crude amputation, chronic infection leading to systemic weakness. Blinded eyes from sword strikes or infections, leaving men dependent on others for basic navigation. Facial disfigurement from blows that shattered jaws or cheekbones. Injuries that in modern times would be reconstructed but in the Viking Age simply healed wrong, leaving permanent damage affecting eating, speaking, breathing. Chronic pain from spinal injuries, crushed joints, improperly set fractures. These men lived in constant discomfort without access to effective pain management. Their conditions worsened over time as infections persisted, injuries degraded, and age compounded existing damage. What made disabled veteran status particularly bitter was the social marginalisation. A raider returned wealthy and healthy was celebrated. His violence abroad translated to status at home. A raider returned poor and disabled was a problem, a mouth to feed, a burden, a reminder of raiding's costs. Extended families might support disabled veterans initially, but resentment grew as resources dwindled. Some disabled men ended up begging, travelling between settlements asking for food and shelter, trading on past warrior status for charity. Others were effectively abandoned, given minimal support, housed in outbuildings, kept away from social gatherings where their damaged bodies would disturb the community. The same society that celebrated raiders when successful had little patience for those who returned broken. Archaeological evidence shows this marginalisation concretely. Burial studies reveal men with healed but severe combat injuries buried in pauper graves or in isolated locations away from main cemeteries. Despite probable warrior backgrounds, evidenced by healed weapon wounds, muscular development patterns, sometimes buried with weapons, they received minimal burial rites and poor grave goods. This suggests they died impoverished and marginalised despite earlier service. One particularly striking example, a skeleton showing signs of amputation of the right hand, healed over indicating survival for some time after injury, buried in a shallow grave with no goods whatsoever. This man probably fought in raids, suffered a disabling injury, survived initially, then died poor and alone, forgotten by the society he'd risked himself to enrich. Modern veterans theoretically have disability benefits, VA healthcare, adaptive equipment, social recognition of service-connected disability. The reality often falls short, as contemporary veterans with disabilities can attest. But at minimum, there's a framework recognising that disability from military service deserves societal support. Viking raiders had no such framework. You raided at your own risk, and if you came back damaged, that was your problem to solve. The community owed you nothing beyond family obligation, which itself was limited by resource scarcity. The dream of returning wealthy enough to secure your family's future could become the nightmare of returning disabled, consuming resources you'd hoped to generate, slowly bankrupting the family you'd tried to save. The mathematics were cruel. You gambled your body's functionality for silver, you lost the gamble but survived, and now you had neither functional body nor sufficient silver to compensate. And you got to live for years or decades with that outcome, watching your family's economic situation deteriorate because of your presence, knowing your raiding decision had made everything worse, unable to undo the injuries or go back and make different choices. That's the boring tragedy that sagas don't celebrate. Men who survived but wished they hadn't. Men whose families quietly wished the same. Men who became object lessons in raiding's costs. Living, breathing advertisements for staying home, and accepting poverty rather than risking permanent disability in pursuit of temporary wealth. Chapter 23. The Wasted Silver. The silver that raiders risk their lives to earn rarely translated into lasting economic security. Most raiders who returned wealthy were poor again within months or at most a few years. The social and economic pressures on newly wealthy men in Viking society ensured rapid wealth dissipation through gambling, drinking, social obligations, inflation, and poor financial planning. The psychological factors compounded this. Traumatized men self-medicating with alcohol, impulsive spending driven by survivors' guilt, desperate attempts to maintain status through generosity. The boring economic reality. Sudden windfalls rarely produce lasting security, especially when acquired by people without financial education and distributed within social systems that redistribute wealth aggressively. The mechanisms of wealth dissipation were predictable. Gambling was pervasive in Norse culture. Dice games, board games, betting on fights or contests. Newly wealthy raiders were prime targets. They had silver to lose. They were psychologically inclined toward risk-taking. They were often drunk, and they were surrounded by friends eager to separate them from their wealth. A successful raider might win substantial silver on a raid, then lose much of it in gambling within weeks of returning. Drinking represented another drain. Mead and ale consumed in quantities that would impress modern college students, with the raider expected to share generously. Demonstrating wealth through excessive drinking and treating others was socially mandatory for maintaining warrior status. What made wealth loss particularly inevitable was the social obligation system. Raiders who returned wealthy were expected to be generous, hosting feasts, giving gifts to allies, supporting family members, demonstrating their success through conspicuous consumption and distribution. Refusing these obligations meant social death. You'd be labelled stingy, ungenerous, someone who didn't understand how warrior society worked. But meeting these obligations consumed wealth rapidly. You'd host a feast, slaughtering livestock, providing drink for the entire community, giving gifts to important attendees. This single event might consume 1/3 of your raid earnings. Then came gift obligations to kinsmen, payments to political allies, pressure to upgrade your home or equipment to match your status. The arms race of display consumption meant that even substantial wealth evaporated quickly. The hoards buried throughout Scandinavia tell a related story. These caches of silver coins, arm rings and hack silver were buried by raiders, sometimes for safekeeping, sometimes before a raid with the plan to retrieve them on return. Many were never recovered, suggesting the owner died or never returned. But the existence of hoards also suggests that some raiders understood the wealth dissipation problem and tried to protect assets by hiding them, only to lose them anyway through death or inability to return or simply forgetting where they'd buried them. The ones found by archaeologists represent the failures, wealth removed from circulation, benefiting no one, eventually becoming museum displays rather than economic security. Consider the economic cycle from the raider's perspective. You risk your life, watch friends die, participate in atrocities, survive through luck. You return with enough silver to theoretically secure your family for years. Within 2 months, half is gone to gambling and social obligations. Within 6 months, you're hosting another feast to maintain status, giving gifts you can't afford, drinking heavily to manage trauma symptoms. Within a year, the silver is gone, and you're facing the same economic pressures that made you raid initially, except now you're traumatized, possibly disabled, and the easy targets in England are increasingly well defended. So you raid again if you're still capable, because what else can you do? The cycle perpetuates itself. The wealth was never meant to last. It was meant to be converted into status, which required constant expenditure, which required constant raiding, until you finally died in the process. We see similar patterns in lottery winners, professional athletes, musicians. Sudden wealth coupled with lack of financial education and poor social networks produces predictable wealth dissipation. The Vikings had no financial advisors, no investment strategies, no concept of compound interest or asset diversification. They had silver, social pressure to spend it, and psychological damage that encouraged impulsive behaviour. The result was inevitable. The boring truth about raiding economics. The risks were enormous, the violence was real, the trauma was lasting, and the financial gains were temporary. Most men who successfully raided and returned wealthy died poor anyway, just took longer and involved more feasts. The mathematics never worked in raiders' favour. The system was designed to extract violence from young men, reward them temporarily, then recapture that wealth through social mechanisms perpetuating the cycle. The silver circulated, enriching jarls and merchants and innkeepers. The raiders got scars, trauma, temporary status, and eventual poverty. That's the equation that sustained Viking raiding for 2 centuries. Individual costs exceeding individual gains, but systemic structures benefiting from the exploitation. Boring economics, written in wasted silver and wasted lives. Chapter 24. The family cost. While raiders crossed the North Sea seeking fortune, their families remained behind, facing their own set of hardships. Viking raiding wasn't just dangerous for the raiders, it was destabilising for entire communities. Women and children suddenly had to run farms without male labour during crucial growing seasons. Families faced vulnerability to rival clans or raiders from other regions. The uncertainty about whether husbands and fathers were alive created ambiguous losses that could last years, and the men who returned were often fundamentally changed, bringing trauma and violence back into domestic spaces. The family cost of raiding was distributed across generations, paid in domestic violence, economic instability, orphans and widows who had to rebuild lives without knowing if they were widows at all. The immediate practical challenge was agricultural survival. Scandinavian farming was marginal at best. Short growing seasons, poor soil in many regions, constant threat of crop failure. Successful farming required intensive labour: ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting, animal husbandry, repairs to buildings and tools. When men left for raiding seasons, typically late spring through early fall, precisely the most labour-intensive agricultural period, women and children and elderly had to manage everything. A farm that struggled with full family labour became nearly impossible with half the workforce gone. Some families collapsed economically during the raiding season, unable to bring in harvests, losing livestock, falling into debt that would drive the next generation to raid in turn. The cycle was self-perpetuating. What made family situations particularly painful was the ambiguous loss. Raiders who didn't return might be dead, or captured, or stranded in England, or decided to settle there, or were delayed and would return next season. Families had no way to know. A wife whose husband didn't return with the fleet faced years of uncertainty. Maintain the farm hoping he'd return, or accept widowhood and move on. Some women waited years before remarrying, maintaining impossible loyalty to men who were likely dead. Others remarried after 1 or 2 seasons, making pragmatic choices for survival, only to have dead husbands return years later to find their wives remarried, their property divided, their children raised by other men. The resulting conflicts sometimes turned violent, adding domestic tragedy to raiding tragedy. The sagas contain multiple stories of exactly these conflicts, always from the returning warrior's perspective, portraying the remarried wife as unfaithful, the new husband as usurper, justifying violence as righteous revenge. Read from the wife's perspective, these are stories of impossible choices. Wait indefinitely for a probably dead husband while you and your children starve, or remarry for survival, and face violence if he returns. Some families were destroyed twice, once by the raider's departure and absence, again by his return. The children caught in these situations faced torn loyalties, violence between the men in their lives, economic instability, and psychological trauma that would shape the next generation. The cycle continued. Boys from unstable families with absent or violent fathers became raiders themselves, perpetuating the pattern. Modern military deployments create similar family stresses, though with crucial differences: defined deployment lengths, communication systems, legal frameworks for family support, psychological services for reintegration. Viking families had none of these. Deployments were indefinite, communication impossible, legal frameworks minimal, psychological support non-existent. The families bore enormous costs, economic, psychological, social, for raiding activities that often benefited them minimally. The silver might never come back. The husband might never come back. Or worse, he might come back traumatized and violent, turning the home into another war zone. The fantasy of raiding improving family economic security collapsed when examined against actual outcomes. Most families would have been better off if their men stayed home, accepted poverty, and at least remained alive and present. But the cultural mythology of raiding as path to prosperity, combined with economic desperation, kept sending men away and leaving families to cope with the consequences. The boring tragedy: economic systems that exploited male violence externally produced domestic violence internally, distributing trauma across entire communities, damaging multiple generations, all in service of an economic model that enriched a few and destroyed many. The families paid costs they never agreed to, for benefits they rarely received, while being told they should be proud of their raiders' sacrifices. The pride wore thin when you were starving because your husband was dead in England and you couldn't bring in the harvest alone. Chapter 25. The Fatal Mathematics. Let us now calculate the actual odds, strip away the mythology, and examine the fatal mathematics of Viking raiding. Modern historians and archaeologists, analysing burial patterns, demographic data, saga accounts, and chronicle descriptions, can estimate survival rates and economic outcomes with reasonable accuracy. The results are damning. For young men engaging in active raiding, life expectancy was late 20s to early 30s. The probability of death or serious disability on any single raid ranged from 10% to 30% depending on English defensive preparations. Over multiple raids, these probabilities compounded. A man who raided 5 times had a roughly 50-70% cumulative chance of being killed or permanently disabled. The economic gains, when averaged across all participants rather than just survivors, were minimal or negative. Raiding was a losing proposition for most individuals who engaged in it, but structured so that the losses were distributed among many while gains concentrated among few. The mortality statistics tell the story. Archaeological excavations of burial sites from the Viking Age show clusters of young male deaths, groups of men in their 20s dying in similar time periods, suggesting raiding party casualties. The age distribution is striking. Very few male skeletons showing combat trauma survive past age 40. Those who do often show signs of serious healed injuries, suggesting they were the rare lucky survivors of multiple engagements. The modal age at death for males with combat injuries is late 20s. These aren't old men dying of accumulated war wounds. These are young men dying early from violence. For comparison, men in the same communities who don't show combat trauma tend to live into their 50s and 60s. The raiding lifestyle subtracted decades from life expectancy. What made the mathematics truly fatal was the cumulative risk calculation. Each raid was a separate gamble with roughly similar odds. The first raid might kill 15% of the party. Not terrible odds for those desperate enough to try. But if you survived and raided again, you face similar odds anew. By the 5th raid, if we assume 15% mortality per raid, your cumulative survival probability drops to roughly 44%, worse than a coin flip. Of course, raid mortality varied. Some were disastrous with 50% plus losses, others had minimal casualties. But averaged over time and many raids, the mathematics were inexorable. The more you raided, the more certain your death became. The question wasn't whether you die raiding, but when. 1st raid, 5th raid, 10th raid. Very few men survived to retire from raiding. They died in action or became too disabled to continue, and disability without modern medicine usually meant early death anyway. The economic analysis is equally grim. If we calculate expected value, average gains times probability of survival minus costs, raiding was a bad bet for most participants. The few who survived multiple raids and managed to keep their wealth did well, creating survivorship bias in saga accounts. But most raiders either died earning nothing, survived but spent their gains quickly, or returned disabled and consumed family resources. When you distribute total wealth gained across all participants, including the dead and disabled, the average return was less than what cautious farmers earned through patient agricultural work. The economics only made sense from the perspective of jarls and organisers who took large shares with lower personal risk, or from the perspective of raiders so desperate that even a small chance of gain outweighed certain poverty. So here we are, at the end of 25 chapters examining the brutal reality of Viking raiding. Strip away the mythology of glory and adventure and see what remains. A violent economic system that exploited desperate young men, extracted their labour and lives, distributed most gains to established power holders, and left trauma, death and disability in its wake. The fatal mathematics were clear even then. Saga writers knew most raiders died young. But economic systems don't operate on rational individual calculation. They operate on systemic incentives that push individuals into choices that benefit the system while harming the individuals. Viking raiding sustained itself for 2 centuries, not because it was good for raiders, but because it was good for jarls, merchants, and established powers who profited from others' violence. By the time you understood the mathematics, you'd already rolled the dice and survived, or hadn't. The lucky survivors perpetuated the myth. The dead couldn't contradict it. And the next generation of desperate young men hearing only the survivor stories, looked at poverty at home and gambled on England abroad. The house always wins. The mathematics were always fatal. The system continued anyway, grinding up young men for centuries until England's defences and Scandinavian Christianisation finally changed the cost-benefit enough to end the cycle. That's boring history. Not heroes and adventure, but economics and exploitation, written in statistical probabilities and demographic data, and mass graves full of men who died in their 20s for silver they never spent. The mathematics don't lie, even when the myths do. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the brutal reality of Viking raiding. 25 chapters examining every angle. From the recruitment that exploited desperate farmers, through the deadly North Sea crossings that killed before combat began, to the actual raiding with its combination of violence and disease, to the internal betrayals and English resistance, to the psychological and physical costs paid by survivors. We've seen how overloaded ships sank on return voyages, how disease killed more than swords, how weather was deadlier than armies. We've explored the disabled veterans cast aside, the silver wasted through gambling and social pressure, the families destroyed by absence or traumatised returns, and the fatal mathematics that meant most raiders died young and poor. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, I hope you have a clearer picture now of why you wouldn't have lasted a day on a Viking raid. Not from lack of capability, but because the system was designed, perhaps unintentionally but effectively nonetheless, to consume young men and extract maximum labour and violence from them while providing minimal returns to most participants. The survivors who returned wealthy and whole were statistical outliers, not representative samples. For every successful raider celebrated in Saga, there were dozens who died on first attempts, who returned disabled and impoverished, or who survived but were so damaged psychologically that success became meaningless. The boring truth we've circled throughout this exploration is that Viking raiding wasn't an adventure or a path to glory. It was an economic system built on exploitation of desperation. Young men with no prospects were sold dreams of wealth and status, sent on missions with survival rates that made success unlikely, and the few who did succeed found their wealth redistributed through social mechanisms that ensured they'd need to raid again. Meanwhile, the jarls and merchants and organisers who profited from raiding but bore less personal risk accumulated lasting wealth and power. It's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. Those who control violent systems profit from them. Those who execute the violence bear the costs. You could almost close your eyes now and drift off with that sobering picture in mind. The reality behind the mythology, the brutal economics behind the adventure stories, the human costs of systems that romanticize violence while obscuring its consequences. And that would be a reasonable place to end our exploration. But before you drift off completely, I want to spend a few more minutes, just a few, examining one more angle. Because the story of Viking raiding isn't just about the Vikings themselves, or even about their English victims. It's about something larger. What this pattern of violence tells us about human societies, about how we structure incentives, about how we remember history, and about patterns that continue today in different forms. Stay with me just a little longer. The uncomfortable truth is that the dynamics we've explored tonight aren't ancient history. They're patterns that repeat across human societies whenever certain conditions align. The specific details change. We don't have literal Viking raids anymore, but the underlying structures persist. Young people with limited economic prospects being recruited with promises that rarely materialise. Violent systems that profit organisers while destroying participants. Mythology that celebrates violence while obscuring costs. Societies that create desperate populations and then express shock when desperation manifests as destructive behaviour. Consider modern military recruitment in economically depressed areas, where promises of education, training and economic advancement draw young people into conflicts that leave many dead, disabled or psychologically damaged. Or gang recruitment in marginalised communities, where lack of legitimate economic opportunity creates conditions where violent alternatives seem rational, or exploitative gig economy systems that promise freedom and wealth while extracting maximum labour for minimum compensation. The patterns rhyme across centuries. Desperation is exploited, violence or exploitation is normalised, costs are distributed among many, while profits concentrate among few, and societies look away from the mechanisms while celebrating exceptional success stories. The Viking Age ended. Raiding became unsustainable as English defences evolved, as Scandinavian societies Christianised and integrated into European political structures, as economic alternatives emerged. But the underlying dynamics that created raiding, population pressure, resource scarcity, political fragmentation, and the mathematical certainty that some people in desperate circumstances will make desperate choices, these haven't disappeared. They've just found new expressions in new contexts. We've gotten better at hiding the mechanisms, at creating plausible deniability, at building systems where exploitation happens at arm's length so those who benefit don't have to watch those who suffer. The boring history lesson, then, isn't just about Vikings. It's about recognising these patterns when they emerge in our own time, in our own societies. About being sceptical of glory narratives that obscure violence. About understanding that desperate people make desperate choices, and that if we want different outcomes, we need to address the desperation rather than simply condemning the choices. About recognising that systems built on exploitation tend to perpetuate themselves precisely because they benefit those with power to change them. You could sleep now with that uncomfortable contemporary parallel in mind, thinking about how little has changed in human nature and social structures across 12 centuries. How we keep building systems that harm many to benefit few, then express surprise when the harm manifests. That would be a worthwhile reflection to carry into dreams, but I want to leave you with something slightly different, something softer, before you drift away entirely. One more turn, one more pivot, and then we'll let you rest. Just a moment longer. Thank you for staying with me through this long, dark journey through history. I know these explorations can be heavy. We don't shy away from the brutal realities, from the violence and suffering and injustice that fills so much of the historical record. It would be easier to tell comfortable stories about heroes and adventures, to let mythology stand unchallenged. But that's not what boring history is about. We're here to look at the unglamorous realities, the statistical probabilities, the systemic patterns that created individual tragedies. We're here to strip away romance and see what actually happened to actual humans, caught in historical forces beyond their control. If you found value in this exploration, if these long-form deep dives into historical reality help you think differently about past and present, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing that makes a real difference in allowing me to continue creating these videos. And if you want to go deeper, the Patreon community helps support the research that makes these explorations possible, but that's entirely optional, no pressure at all. Your attention tonight has been gift enough. For those drifting off now, may your sleep be peaceful and your dreams gentle. You've earned rest after walking through history's darkness with me. Let the weight of these stories settle softly as you drift away, the voices and violence fading into the comfortable silence of your own safe space. And for those still lingering, still alert, I have just a few final thoughts. Not about Vikings specifically, but about history itself, about why we do this, about what it means to look unflinchingly at human brutality and suffering across centuries. Just a few more minutes, and then I promise we'll release you to whatever rest awaits. History is filled with violence. That's an uncomfortable truth, but unavoidable if we're being honest. Most of human history has been marked by war, conquest, exploitation, suffering distributed unequally across populations. The Viking Age represents just one chapter in that larger story, neither uniquely brutal nor notably gentle, just human beings operating within systems that incentivized violence and responding to incentives the way humans always do. What makes history valuable isn't pretending this violence didn't happen, or wasn't that bad. It's looking directly at it, understanding the mechanisms that created it, and hopefully learning enough to recognise similar patterns before they fully manifest in our own time. The young Norse farmers who became raiders weren't monsters. They were people facing impossible choices in resource-constrained circumstances. The English victims weren't helpless innocents. They lived in a wealthy society built partially on their own historical conquests and exploitations. The Jarls who organised raids weren't uniquely evil. They were optimising within their cultural and economic context. Everyone was responding rationally to incentives. The tragedy is that rational responses to local incentives produce systemic horror, and that individuals caught in these systems had no good options available. This is why we study history in detail, why we spend hours examining what daily life was actually like, rather than memorising dates and names. The detailed examination reveals the human beings buried under abstractions. The Viking raids of textbooks become specific young men vomiting from seasickness while rowing across the North Sea, become families left behind to manage impossible farming without enough labour, become disabled veterans begging for food in villages that once honoured them. The English victims stop being abstract casualties and become specific people with names and families and lives interrupted by violence they didn't cause and couldn't prevent. When you sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those fog-shrouded beaches we imagined at the beginning. The dragon ships emerging from mist, the moment of terrible recognition, the chaos that followed. Or perhaps you'll dream of farmsteads in Norway, women and children bringing in harvests alone, wondering if husbands and fathers will return. Or perhaps you'll dream of something entirely different, your mind processing the information its own way, making its own connections, finding its own meaning in the darkness we've explored together. Whatever you dream, I hope you wake tomorrow with a clearer sense of how the past actually worked. Not the sanitized version, but the real, brutal, boring reality of humans making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. And perhaps when you encounter modern narratives that romanticize violence or promise glory through conflict, you'll remember the fatal mathematics we discussed tonight. You'll remember that for every survivor celebrated, there are masses of casualties we've forgotten. You'll remember that systems built on exploitation harm those they exploit, obviously, but also that the harm persists across generations and societies. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your attention through 25 chapters and all these reflections. Thank you for being willing to sit with uncomfortable truths rather than seeking comfortable fictions. This is what boring history is all about. The reality behind the mythology, the statistics behind the stories, the boring truth that most of history was neither glorious nor adventurous, but simply brutal, tragic, and human. Sleep well, dear listener. Rest easy. And perhaps tomorrow you'll look at the world with slightly different eyes, seeing the patterns we've discussed reflected in contemporary structures, recognizing exploitation when it's wrapped in glory narratives, understanding that the question isn't whether humans are capable of violence, we obviously are, but whether we're capable of building systems that don't require it. That question remains open across centuries. Until next time, good night.